have free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education. Quality primary and secondary education for all in just 8 years. So the question there is that going to happen? Will all children attain quality secondary education when we know that so many countries, not even access is finished in the case of secondary, and we see huge dropout rates of girls, particularly in secondary level? Will actually all children attain quality primary education? And actually, we need to ask our questions. Will all children learn the fundamental literacy and numeracy skills? Right? Are we there in order to achieve that minimum objective? Right? And we say quality primary education. Well, quality primary education is at least being able to read with understanding by the end of primary. Well, what that number today of the percentage of children who cannot do that, who cannot read and with understanding by the age of 10, is 70%. That's a gigantic number. So then it calls into question, is that 70% going to down as fast as we need by 2030? If we see the evolution of this number, it's a bit scary, I would say. This number that we called learning poverty, because we wanted to have something which is exactly as the SDG 4.1.1, but in a phrasing that couldn't be understood by any parent, by any teacher. Can your children read a 10? And the percentage of children who cannot read a 10 by 2015 was 53% in low and middle income countries. Unfortunately, with the last data that we have, we see that by 2019, that number had increased a little bit to 57%. So this is really bad news, because it was saying that before the pandemic, we were not moving in the right direction. Even before the pandemic, the percentage of children who could not read was increasing slightly. So we could not be saying, well, look, we need to move faster. No, we needed a turning point even before the pandemic. Now, unfortunately, the simulations that we have with the pandemic shows that this number might be increasing by 13 points. Hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully our simulations are wrong, and it's not that 70 and maybe it's a bit lower. But unfortunately, the evidence that we find, so for some countries who have taken seriously the issue of measuring learning, like Brazil, for example, right, who was serious, we need to measure what's going on, and they do have measures about what's happening in the country. Or there's some measures in South Africa, some measures in India, and we see that unfortunately, yes, reading is going down, right, and fundamental skills are not improving or have deteriorated. So we had a crisis before the pandemic. Now we have a deeper crisis. Right, so the question is, if we see 2030, actually the SDG 4 in 2030 was talking about zero learning poverty. Because if the SDG was saying quality education for all, that means that all kids should have been able to read, right, by that time. That might not be happening. Now, fortunately, I mean, many countries are already defining targets for 2030. And if we see those targets, they are consistent with at least reducing by half that learning poverty. So moving from 70 to some number around 30. That would be great. That would be great. But that will be very difficult. That will be very difficult because that will imply an improvement in terms of our capacity to provide the right education service, right, at a rate that we have never seen in the past. Just achieving what you see in that yellow line is something that will be very difficult. It's something that we have not seen. But actually, that's what's absolutely critical to do. And now, unfortunately, that's in a context in which we're living the worst education crisis in a century. While we spoke about that initial 53% of learning poverty, that now it's 70%. But in addition, we see that if that happens, that will imply a shock in the future income of this generation because of lost productivity in the future. We have seen that there's increases in anxiety and depression, and in general in mental health among children. We have seen that many children have lost their meals during the pandemic. And more importantly, we see potentially an inequality catastrophe, because within countries, even if we say there have been learning losses, those learning losses within country has not been exactly the same. Moreover, we can say that within countries, only the better off have been able to have a relatively decent engagement to education during the pandemic. And the majority, not just the poorest, most likely the majority in many countries have not been able to have a decent education service during 1 or 2 years that were the school closures that we have been living. So this is a really serious crisis. Now, is there something that can be done? Yes, there are many things that can be done, but let me mention very quickly 3 things. Do we have, ask the questions, do we have the adequate technical design? Do we have the resources? And do we have the political commitment to solve this crisis? And then if we talk about technical design, and Catherine Russell already mentioned these issues, yes, we do have evidence-based proven interventions that can work and that some countries are already implementing. That's what we call in this report that we were working with 6 institutions a rapid approach, just to have a systematic way of putting together different interventions and programs that some countries are already doing, right? Reaching all children and retaining them in school, making sure that schools are open and that you enroll children. Second, assess learning, because countries need to know where are the levels of learning today, and teachers need to know what's the level of learning of each one of their students. We need to prioritize the fundamentals, because we cannot cover the whole curriculum. It's going to be impossible. We need to do increased catch-up learning, teaching at the right level, structured pedagogy, increase instructional time. Right? We need to be super creative in making sure that we give each student within a classroom the stimulation that they need and teach at the level where they are today. And finally, we need to develop interventions to support psychological well-being of teachers and of students. We can go in a lot of detail in each one of these 5 columns, but the only thing that I wanted to say is that the potential interventions exist and they are doable. I'm not saying that they are easy, but they are doable. But what do we need for that? We need another thing. We need some resources. Right? And actually, we need at this stage that countries expand the resources in education, or at least protect the resources and the financial resources going to education. And is that happening? And unfortunately, we see that no, that's not the case. At least with the data that we have for 2019 and 2020, we see that government spending in education is falling in lower middle-income countries and in upper middle-income countries. It's been protected in poorest countries. So this is not moving in the right direction. Resources have to move in the right direction. But it's not only resources. Sometimes we say, well, we are not doing what we need to do because there's no money. And that is not true in many cases. Yes, money is needed, particularly if you see a country, a low-income country that spends $200 per student, of course, more resources will be needed. Or even a middle-income country that spends only $1,000 per student, more resources are needed. OECD countries that spend $10,000 per student. So yes, resources are needed, but we have seen many reforms, right, in many countries in which a jump in terms of improving learning has happened even without the resources. Why? Because there has been political commitment. And that's the other thing, that's the final thing that we need. We need political commitment. Sometimes money is the binding constraint, but sometimes it's not. Right? It's first, when we talk about political commitment, the internalization of the magnitude of the crisis is an internalization by the society as a whole that, yes, we do have a problem, and not sugarcoat the issue. Second is that all decisions have to be centered around the well-being and learning of children. It's not about the interest of unions, it's not about the interest of suppliers, it's not about the interest of vendors, it's not about the interest of bureaucrats. It's only about the interest of children. Right? And sometimes that implies taking tough decisions. But if those tough decisions are not taken, then we'll not improve. And finally, we need to ensure managerial capacity of the bureaucracy, because everything that we do has to be done at scale. I don't care about 10 schools. I care about 50,000 schools in a middle-income country, in a small middle-income country. So let me close by saying that, as Catherine was saying, the time to act is now, right? We need to make sure that not only the education crowd that is sitting in this room is convinced and internalizes the problem, but the societies as a whole understand that if we don't act now, we're putting at risk the future of our children and the future of our countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaime. Greatly appreciate it. Everyone could sense your passion. Really greatly appreciate it, Jaime. I mean, we started this meeting saying we were all going to be convinced. I think ever more so we are now. And what I think we're projecting by 3:30, we're all going to go out and kind of further mobilize additional partners. So we've talked about the commitment to action. So it's to act to do what? Jaime also mentioned RAPID. Executive Director Russell's mentioned RAPID, the acronym RAPID. We're going to get into that. But I'm going to pass the floor now to two colleagues, friends who are eminently qualified to take us one more step further into the actions. One is Dr. Ben Piper, the Global Director of Education with the Gates Foundation, and another is Dr. Rukmini Banerjee, who is online. She's the CEO of Pratham. I'm going to first pass the floor to Dr. Ben Piper, please.
Thank you so much. Honorable Ministers, development partner colleagues, distinguished guests, welcome. I'm very pleased to be here today to add the voice of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to this important discussion. The growing call to address the current global learning crisis and emergency, as Rob has said, through concrete action and commitment. What can we do about it? At the Foundation, we believe that all people deserve the right to a healthy and productive life. And the reason we invest in global education is because a healthy and productive life is fundamentally impossible if you can't read and you can't do your basic math skills. I've spent the last 15 years of my career with the immense privilege of working and living in East Africa. And in that time, it allows me to go and visit classrooms in rural areas. And last 2 months, I've seen four programs that are trying to respond to this learning crisis that have been implemented in rural contexts in Ethiopia, in Zambia, and in Kenya. I didn't miscount. One of those countries had 2 programs. Now, what I saw in those programs were committed teachers with typical classrooms, very large classrooms, 60 kids, 70 kids, but typical teachers with the right resources that allowed them to be effective, that allowed them, even in these rural contexts, even with limited investments, limited salaries, to do a good job teaching in those contexts. But as Jaime has said, the problems are twofold. There's too few of those schools in these countries, and there are too few countries who are actively using this RAPID framework to respond to the magnitude of the crisis. The evidence shows that getting these foundations right supports children to learn their full potential. And as Rob said, there are proven solutions, which we will learn more about from the honorable ministers who will speak to today, that can actually make a difference. So let me give an example from these countries that I observed of the sorts of interventions that are working in small scale and could work at large scale if implemented well. If you remember in Jaime's presentation, under the letter I, one of them was a term called structured pedagogy. So structured pedagogy is one of the interventions that has the evidence base for making a meaningful difference on learning outcomes. So structured pedagogy programs are programs that support teachers with a combination of activities to make their teaching better. Number one, that teacher has a lesson plan that supports them to do the complex task of teaching early literacy or early numeracy. Secondly, those children in those classrooms have a textbook, have a workbook they actually can learn from to learn the complex task of literacy or numeracy. Those teachers are not just trained once off, they're given skills-based training to know how to use those lessons and to know how to support their learners. And fourthly, each of those teachers has coaching or other support to help them in the complex change process. That package of interventions is called structured pedagogy. The second, my good friend and colleague Rukmini will talk about in more detail, but it's the idea of teaching at the level of the child. Curriculum in many countries, including the country where I'm from, the United States, are pitched at this level, right? But many children, when I was a teacher in the US, many of my children were at this level. So if I'm teaching at this level, I'm missing a significant number of children. So programs that are designed to teach at the right level of the child are tailoring their instruction to the needs of the children. The classrooms that I observed over the last couple of weeks, the last couple of months, are grouping children based on their skills and supporting them. If they don't know their letters, let's teach them their letters. If they know their letters but they don't know syllables, let's show them how one letter and another letter come together to make a syllable. If they know their syllables but they don't know how to read, let's practice with the segmenting and blending skills that they need. That's teaching at the level of the child. And finally, remediation. This is increased instructional time for foundational skills. And the program I observed in Zambia last week, it's an additional hour every single day that these children had to practice numeracy and to practice literacy. These are complex tasks that children and teachers need more time to be able to implement. So structured pedagogy, teaching at the level of the child, and remediation. I'm very encouraged by the excitement and the energy in this room, but as Rob said, we need to take the passion and focus on responding to the learning crisis with these evidence-based strategies beyond the confines of the people here so that we can support countries to move forward. And I urge all of the development partners to continue to do the complex task of effectively coordinating our efforts in support of these countries in this room and beyond, who are supporting to end learning poverty and make sure that our collective commitment to improve foundational learning is prominently on the agenda of the summit in September. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ben. Can I pass now to you, Rukmini? I'm hoping the technology is not going to fail us. Oh, there you are. Hi. Well, I see you on the smaller screen. We're just going to get you up on the bigger one. But go ahead, Rukmini. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon and namaste to everyone. I'm so privileged that even though I'm far away, you have invited me into the room in Paris. And as Rob and Jaime and others have been speaking, I thought that since I come from one of the world's most crowded countries, I should give you two concrete examples of what is possible. One done by the government and one done by people. We are all aware, and Jaime has laid out for us the magnitude of the problem, the big declines that we have seen in learning. I want to give you my first example from the state of Karnataka in India, where, as Ben was describing, we partnered with the government of the state on a teaching at the right level approach. Now, you all know that schools in India were closed for a very long time, almost 2 years, but the government in this state was ready the minute the schools opened to hit the ground running. So I think this commitment to foundational learning also means being prepared to jump in as soon as possible with as much preparation as you can do so that you do not waste any time. I wanted to just give you a little bit of a background that because we have data for the last 10 years on basic learning from the annual status of education report, the USER report in India, we know that in this particular state of Karnataka, on any given year, a typical year before COVID, children's ability to begin to read moved up about 14 or 15 percentage points in a normal year. As soon as schools opened in January of 2022, the government implemented this teaching at the right level program across the state. And we saw that in a short period of January to end of March, which had some breaks because of Omicron, but you still got in about 60 or 70 instructional days. The government put aside an hour for reading and an hour for basic math for their grades 4 and 5, 40,000 schools, close to 900,000 or 1 million children. And we saw that the percentage gain that was possible at this time was almost 30 percentage points. So in 3 months' time, Post-COVID, once schools open, you could actually double what you could do in a normal year because of the extra efforts that were put in. So when we went in, that the baseline, about 25% of children in grades 4 and 5 were able to read and understand a simple story. But by the time we reached March, end of March, this number had gone up to almost 60%. All done by our government school teachers across the state with whatever resources they had, and with many of the elements that Ben described of mentoring, of support, and of all together reaching this goal. So this for us is a huge learning that if you can get in as quickly as possible, commit your resources, focus on a simple goal that we need to get the potential of the possibility of children catching up quickly, it can happen. 40,000 schools is a lot of schools. We had summer vacations in India. They happened a little bit earlier in many states because it was very hot this year. And so I want to bring you a second example from the people of India. We in Pratham organized a, no, we don't need the slide, I can just speak. We in India organized, Ken, we don't need the slides, you can remove the slides, yeah. We in India organized a call to young people in many of our villages to say that can we use a month or 6 weeks of the summer to do catch-up small learning camps using the elements of our teaching at the right level method, but being done in a very frugal way in the neighborhood. And across almost 30,000 villages, 70 to 75,000 young people came forward completely voluntarily. We are just concluding this campaign, and we think there will have been significant results and significant ownership of the village for the growth of learning for their children. I bring you these two examples to say that concrete action is possible. It is possible right now. And like many of you, ever since our schools opened after 2 years, I've been traveling a lot across the country. And I feel the moment is so right. Children are happy to be back in school. Teachers are happy to be back in school. And we all know as parents that we're absolutely delighted that after such a long time that children couldn't go back. So energy is high. Everybody wants positive results. I think it's just a question of everybody tightening their belt, getting down into the action, and actually bringing the world back to a better place than where we were. Thank you so much for giving me the time.
Thank you very much, Rukmini. Very, very impressive results in a very limited, very quick time period. So incredibly impressive. Thank you. So before we turn to 5 different ministers of education from a diverse range of countries who are going to further unpack the rapid framework in their particular context, again with an emphasis on the how, it's my great pleasure to pass the floor to Stephanie Giannini, a good friend of ours, the Deputy Executive Director General of UNESCO. Sorry, I struggled a bit on our titles. Oh, Stephanie, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob. Thanks all of you for being here. So many, so committed, so engaged. The energy is high, as the last speaker said, and we need this kind of energy really to address the many challenges that so brilliantly my dear friend Jaime Saavedra just explained so greatly. Let me first of all thank the World Bank, Unicef, and the other institutions which are on this side of the room for the great cooperation we have had over the last 2 years from the outset of the pandemic around analyzing, acting, designing solutions. And let me say honestly that this initiative today, this call for commitment to start to address one of the pieces of the big puzzle that this Transforming Education Summit is trying to and will succeed for sure, to build in education is very much the outcome of this process. So thank you very much. From a UNESCO perspective and also my personal understanding of lessons learned, some truths we have, and some next steps we have to take to complement a little bit the numbers and solutions that my colleagues Ben, Jaime already explained. First, we learned that learning doesn't happen ex nihilo. The pandemic demonstrated that schools are absolutely irreplaceable spaces for learning, but also for nutrition, for socio-emotional health, for social protection, and other social services, as in another section with Catherine just actually we are focusing on. And this is especially true for those who are already behind. This is especially true for the most vulnerable children. So lessons number one, recovery and transformation requires a systematic focus on health, well-being, and social-emotional dimensions of learning, because these all strongly influence the acquisition of foundational skills. So this is one of the points we have to focus. Second truth, second lessons, more humble to say, we learn the paramount role of teachers that nothing can replace. Neither, a great platform, a more advanced AI system, a tablet, nor a parent or carer. Teachers are teachers, point. And teachers have the power now to be really the game changers in the classroom. To that end, we have to do something. We have to unlock the potential of teachers as our frontline workers and game changers in education. We witness the incredible resourcefulness and dedications of teachers to accompany their students not only academically, but almost in all countries, in all communities, emotionally. So, lessons 2, teachers are at the heart of educational recovery and renewal. The education systems best prepared to respond to crisis and transform will be those capable of valuing their teachers, providing strong professional support, granting them more autonomy, and giving them actually the conditions to work collaboratively. This is one of the, by the way, of the clear messages which comes from the report on the futures of education that UNESCO released last year. Third point, third lessons, the last one, maybe one of the most important one. As it stands now, technology doesn't allow for learning anywhere, anytime. We have clear data on that. We know the power of technology, and we know that there is no future in education, as in many other public sectors, without including technology at the service of the human beings, learners and teachers for education. It has been a divider in this pandemic. At least 1/3 of students couldn't access remote learning. However, technology is a big part of the solution. Lessons number 3, we must steer the digital revolution to advance inclusive quality education by centering innovation on the most marginalized, by expanding investing in open, free, and high-quality digital contents. There are some ministers in this room that I'm sure can bring their own experiences on this side as well. And supporting pedagogical innovation. I think this is a field where we cannot keep, ourselves in the comfort zone and say, this is the business as usual. We did so many decades, at least some centuries. Why we had to change? No, we had to change because the dramatic landscape that Jaime was showcasing on the screen is the reality. Finally, the pandemic changed relationships. And this is another part of the job, dear colleagues. we have to keep in mind, we have to do, to take the responsibility. Change between other basic relationships, the relationships between schools and households. Never have parents and caregivers been so directly involved in their children's learning. And it's been both tough and empowering. I think it's black and white, right? Recovery and transformation should build on this dimension, giving voice to parents, because parental engagement carries strong influence on learning outcomes. So these are the small 3 pieces I wish to bring to the table, but this is a discussion that with my 2 friends, especially Rob Jenkins and Jaime Saavedra, we are having, I could say since years. Now there is the momentum. We are here in this pre-summit at UNESCO, not by chance. We have the ambition, we have the data, we have the commitment. So thank you very much for being on our side. I have, unfortunately, to leave the room, as maybe other colleagues here, but there is a commitment to action that will be presented in the second part. So please be on our side actively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefania. Greatly appreciate it. So now we move into perhaps the most exciting part of the session, which is to hear some country case studies from the ministers themselves, building on earlier discussions and comments already. Thank you so much to the ministers in advance. We have to switch the order around a little bit because I think of different time commitments, etc. So I'm going to pass the floor to Minister Senge from Sierra Leone, please. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No need to play the slide. I think it's important for us to understand that when I do go through this, as my dear friend and co-chair DSG says, this is not small t for ticking the box or tweaking. This is capital T for transformation. And Jaime clearly told us that we have to work at a rate that we've never seen before. And it's possible, and that's why we're here. And so I'll share just briefly a little bit about some of the ways in which we have been undergoing this transformation. And my other dear friend, Rebecca from Brookings, and I, we spoke about purpose, which you mentioned, and Stefania mentioned the pedagogical redesign and systems thinking. I think it's a big mistake if middle-income and high-income countries don't believe that they also need transformation. This is not just about low and poor countries, because ultimately, the misinformation that stems from lack of foundational education and civic action in the West affects all of us. Ultimately, the need to understand and read a simple story in Sierra Leone will affect the European Union. So this is truly a moment in time for transformation across the entire globe. Now, I will speak a little bit about the prioritizing the need to teach fundamentals. We cannot understand the fundamentals if we don't teach them. And, one example that we have in Sierra Leone is really how we've been able to promote accelerated learning through continuous and remedial classes with context-appropriate technology and skills. Now, what does that mean? We all don't take dictionaries and spell check so for granted that even our SMS phones have autocomplete. And when they fail us, we usually pay dearly for that. That's how much we all use the dictionary. And we take it for granted. But In Sierra Leone, one of the things that we did was to create an SMS-enabled and USSD dictionary, such that every child now we don't have to ship a big dictionary to them, but you can send an SMS for free to a system that can allow you to spell check or to know the meaning of a word. And if you're like me, you sign up and you get a word of the day sent to you every day based on your level, such that whether you're in primary school or in senior secondary school or in university, you're able to get constant and continuous access to learning. This is in addition to the radio teaching program that we have. And the radio teaching program is not just about A is for Apple, 1 + 1 is 2, but we're able to teach fundamentals around good citizen behavior, around comprehensive sexuality education, around good civic action. And in addition, think about how we can focus on teacher training. The second part that I wanted to focus on the assessing learning levels and using that to prioritize teaching. We did the EGRA-EGMA studies in Sierra Leone recently with Unicef, and we had the results, and the results we used to define and customize our teacher training such that we went back to the classrooms and to the communities, and so far we've been able to train about 7,000 early grade teachers, and 4,000 of them will be trained later on this year. And most of those, we give solar-powered radios and pre-recorded content and SMS platforms to continue improving their learning and skills. Because improvement and continuous learning is not just about the students. It's also about the teachers who are there. And when we speak about innovation and using innovation context appropriate to promote learning and to transform our educational system, we're thinking the whole way for the students, for the parents, and for the teachers who are involved. To wrap up, some of the important elements for us, I mean, the Minister of Higher and Technical Education as well is here with me at TESS. It's not just about what we do in the classrooms or at home. It's about how we train the teachers who are in the teacher training institutions. It's about the ways in which after they graduate, they can come into the classrooms and continue improving their learning. Because if those teachers don't have the fundamentals themselves, there's no way they're going to teach the fundamentals. And it's important that we continue to do this. And we have what we call the Education Innovation Challenge, where through which we invest in partnerships that some of the examples have been promoting teaching at the right level, as everybody has been mentioning. These are proven methodologies and techniques that improve learning outcomes. This reliance on hybrid technology, as I've spoken about, SMS, radio, and where possible, digital solutions. Everybody must have access to continuous learning. And most importantly, as Jaime mentioned, if you don't have the political will and leadership, none of this is going to go forward. And that leadership really is not just about His Excellency. Now, President Bio can be a good champion for education. I can be a good champion and advocate for foundational learning. But everybody on the team in Sierra Leone, all the way to classrooms, have to be involved. And we have to make sure that this leadership sits across and goes down all the way into the civil society, into the students themselves. And I think if there's any one takeaway from our experiences in Sierra Leone, is that we cannot achieve these outcomes and meet our SDG 4 targets and national benchmarks without the fundamentals. And we cannot meet the fundamentals without teaching the fundamentals. And it's important that we're able to do this at the right level in all classes, across the board, to kids who are in school, those who are out of school. Use mobile where it's possible, use radio where it's possible, and if paper is all you have, use paper as well, because we're going to work within the priorities of each country. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, the Minister of Education from Sierra Leone. Greatly appreciate it. It's my great pleasure now to pass the floor to the Minister of Education from Nigeria, His Excellency Adamu, who's kindly agreed to facilitate this next session, as well as share the example from Nigeria. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. The session is about the great crisis that we are now deep in. And this the sitting here, I think, is facilitated by the government of Nigeria, by Unicef, by UNESCO, by the World Bank, by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and by many international development partners. And it is to look at the crisis that we now have. And with me, one has already talked, and I would like to know whether all of them are around. We have the Director General of the Ministry of Education and Geographical Opening Up of Central African Republic. Is he here? You're welcome. Then we have His Honorable Victor Godoy from Brazil, Minister of Education. You're welcome, sir. Then from Mongolia, we had Amgala Lufsenteren, the Minister of Education, Mongolia. Is he here? He's not here. Okay, the order has already been changed because Central Africa was to speak first, then Sierra Leone has done so. I will now call upon the Minister of Education, Central African Republic, or the Director General representing him, to give us his own position on reaching and retaining learners within schools.
Merci, Excellence, de m'avoir donné la parole. La République centrafricaine a donc pour thème atteindre l'accès aux plus vulnérables et retenir les apprenants. Et nous devons parler des efforts de la République centrafricaine pour accroître donc l'accès à la scolarisation. Nous pouvons dire ceci, Excellence. Avant de prendre la parole, nous voulons remercier tous les acteurs ici présents à cette assise qui apporte une importance aux réponses à apporter pour le système éducatif dans le monde qui connaît aujourd'hui une crise. Et nous devons tous chercher à avoir des solutions pour y remédier. La République centrafricaine a connu ces dernières décennies une crise politique, sécuritaire et humanitaire assez complexe. À l'instar des autres secteurs, le fonctionnement des structures de gestion du système éducatif centrafricain a été fortement affecté. Pour faire face à ce défi, le gouvernement, avec l'appui des partenaires techniques et financiers, a élaboré un plan sectoriel de l'éducation couvrant la période 2020-2029. Et ce plan comprend donc 4 axes stratégiques qui sont l'accès à l'éducation, la qualité de l'éducation, la gouvernance du secteur de l'éducation et les urgences émergentes. Du système éducatif centrafricain. S'agissant des efforts du gouvernement pour accroître l'accès à l'éducation, Son Excellence, Monsieur le Président de la République, chef d'État, a pris un décret pour augmenter progressivement le budget dédié à l'éducation. Et s'en suivra donc la lettre d'engagement de Monsieur le Premier ministre, chef du gouvernement, qui engage le gouvernement à financer le plan sectoriel de l'éducation. Malgré le niveau d'exécution qui ne reflète pas entièrement cette allocation, nous nous engageons à continuer de suivre avec le ministère des Finances afin d'atteindre les objectifs prévus. L'appui des partenaires tels que l'Unicef, la Banque mondiale, l'Union européenne, l'Agence française de développement, l'UNESCO, Education Cannot Wait, le partenaire mondial pour l'éducation, GPE, la coopération française et autres, a permis d'amorcer la mise en œuvre des activités prévues dans le plan sectoriel de l'éducation. Le secteur de l'éducation a subi de plein fouet l'impact de la crise post-électorale du décembre 2020. Près de 1000 écoles ont été fermées, de force occupées ou endommagées à la suite des affrontements. Il s'agit de la deuxième interruption majeure du système éducatif en moins d'un an, après la fermeture des écoles en 2020 en raison de la Covid-19. Pendant près de la moitié de l'année, les enfants ont vu exploser à risque de protection et de déplacement interne, et la situation sécuritaire affectant aussi le déploiement des enseignants dans le pays. Malgré ce contexte difficile, le ministère de l'Éducation a pu prioriser sur des interventions clés pour améliorer l'accès et la rétention, et spécialement pour les plus vulnérables, à savoir 1. La construction et réhabilitation des salles de classe, la dotation des écoles en matériel didactique dans toutes les institutions académiques à travers le projet d'urgence de soutien à l'éducation de base, financé par la Banque mondiale et le programme soutenu par l'Unicef, financé par le GPE Education Cannot Wait. Ces interventions ont contribué efficacement à l'accès des enfants les plus vulnérables à l'école, y compris dans les zones difficiles. Le programme d'enseignement accéléré PEA, appuyé par certains PTF, a facilité le retour des enfants les plus vulnérables, y compris les déscolarisés et les déplacés à l'école et leur réintégration dans le système formel. Le programme d'enseignement par la radio avec l'appui technique et financier de l'Unicef a aussi contribué à l'accroissement de la scolarisation des enfants dans les zones défavorisées. Des leçons en français et en mathématiques pour le niveau primaire ont été préparées, enregistrées et diffusées en français et en langue nationale, le sango, à travers les radios nationales et communautaires. Des clubs d'écoute ont été mis en place, animés par des personnes aux ressources, en utilisant les leçons autour des écoles ciblées pour compléter l'apprentissage et encourager la fréquentation scolaire. Cette méthode permet de prendre l'école plus proche aux communautés. Nous sommes en train de finaliser aussi les leçons pour le secondaire et pour une mise en échelle globale. Des campagnes de sensibilisation de retour des enfants à l'école ont été initiées pour favoriser un retour massif des enfants et surtout des filles à l'école. Nous nous engageons dans une stratégie de dialogue communautaire plus approfondie et pérenne pour assurer une conscientisation de toutes les couches sociales pour adresser un changement des normes sociaux envers l'éducation, spécialement en faveur des filles et des enfants les plus vulnérables. Le programme de démobilisation des enfants issus des groupes armés, avec l'appui technique et financier de l'Unicef et des ONG, a permis la réinsertion des enfants soldats. Nous avons commencé à utiliser une approche de paquet intégré qui comporte un ensemble des activités intégrant l'éducation, la protection et appui psychosocial, roche et changement de normes sociaux et comportementales. Pour obtenir un meilleur et le plus impact, cette approche, dans un contexte de crise, vise à passer une réponse d'urgence et de solutions durables à travers une approche nexus de l'éducation où les communautés bénéficiant de programmes comprennent la population déplacée, réfugiée, retournée et les communautés d'accueil. Le défi reste majeur, mais la volonté du gouvernement, avec les partenaires qui fait de l'éducation l'une des priorités, avec l'appui des partenaires techniques et financiers du secteur éducatif, l'espoir demeure à l'horizon prévu dans le plan sectoriel de l'éducation. C'est ici le lieu de remercier tous les partenaires techniques et financiers qui ne cessent d'appuyer le système éducatif centrafricain, et c'est aussi l'occasion à saisir pour lancer un plaidoyer à l'endroit pour plus de mobilisation en faveur de l'école centrafricaine. Ensemble, nous vaincrons pour un accès inclusif à l'éducation. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Director General Uanifio. I was just wondering, you know, with all these good things you have done, it is possible that some parents or some pupils may refuse to go to school. In Nigeria, we have resorted now to prosecuting parents. How do you ensure that your pupils come to school and they stay?
Aujourd'hui, nous avons mis en place donc une dynamique qui est donc de mettre d'abord la communauté au centre de l'éducation. Et la communauté devait donc être un couloir de transmission entre le ministère de l'Éducation nationale, les autorités au niveau déconcentré, pour mener à bien la politique de l'école de proximité. Et c'est la population, en principe, la communauté qui doit porter l'éducation. Et il faudrait que ce message-là puisse être relayé sur l'ensemble du territoire pour permettre à ces acteurs qui sont les communautés d'appuyer ou bien de prendre à cœur le système éducatif. Et voilà, c'est ce qui est important. Et l'école aujourd'hui en République centrafricaine par rapport à la crise que le pays a subie, c'est un facteur de cohésion sociale où toutes les communautés réunies autour de l'école pourront apporter un vecteur qui puisse développer le système éducatif. Cette stratégie que nous avons mise en place aujourd'hui nécessite beaucoup de mobilisation en ce qui concerne donc les ressources humaines, c'est-à-dire la formation des enseignants, sans oublier aujourd'hui que la République centrafricaine compte aujourd'hui plus de 63% des maîtres par an, qui sont donc les maîtres de communautés. Donc il va falloir mettre en place des stratégies pour les identifier, pour les former, les déployer dans les écoles et assurer leur suivi. Et tout ça, ça dépend à ce que nous puissions mobiliser des ressources. Parce que le pays est en crise, mais les autorités ont privilégié l'éducation qui est devenue aujourd'hui un vecteur de cohésion sociale. Donc il va falloir que nous puissions ensemble nous mettre pour accompagner le système éducatif et mettre vraiment la communauté au centre de la problématique de l'éducation.
Thank you very much. So now let me now take it and tell you our own experience in Nigeria. In Nigeria, as many countries, has prioritized the increasing access to education and reducing the number of out-of-school children. Actually, we have had the highest number for a very long time, but we have been reducing them. Only that there are some natural catastrophes. We take out children from the streets, and then catastrophes send some more. So actually, it is a constant struggle. More than 70% of our school children cannot read with understanding or solve simple mathematical problems. And this has been exacerbated when more than 50 million children were locked out of school in Nigeria during the early stages of COVID-19. Without foundational learning, our children cannot access the curriculum and develop skills they need to thrive in the workforce, to be actively engaged in citizens, or to be useful citizens on the global scene. Because of this, we see learning poverty as both a priority in itself and a key strategy to address the out-of-school phenomenon in our country. The response we have for this has about 5 key pillars. Number 1, creating an enabling policy environment for early learning through legislation, 1 year of compulsory pre-primary education, and supporting mother tongue instruction in the early grades as key determinants of learning success. Number 2, testing and scaling cost-effective evidence-formed models on foundational literacy and numeracy in both development and humanitarian contexts across at least 15 states out of the 36 in Nigeria. 3, ensuring that we have well-prepared, technically qualified, and highly motivated teachers through the full implementation of a comprehensive teacher competency program framework, an effective continuous teacher professional development system, and a robust teacher management information system. Number 4, ensuring the provision of quality, gender-sensitive, and inclusive teaching and learning materials to achieve a print environment in the classroom, and we progressively ensure that every child has his or her own textbook or workbook. And number 5, strengthening system-wide accountability through systemic and formative assessment. In doing this, we have worked closely with Unicef and other international partners in building a framework, comprehensive framework and integrated learning assessment system based on a national learning assessment framework. Nigeria is about to implement a state-of-the-art large-scale learning assessment in all the states of the Federation. This assessment marks a shift away from the rote memorization to competency-based assessment and the use of modern psychometric analysis in order to improve learning outcomes. The assessment will be administered to learners in the grades 3, 5, and 7 and will assess foundation, literacy, and numeracy, and all life skills. The findings from this national assignment will assist us in diagnosing the health of our educational system and to set, implement, and monitor targeted policies to accelerate progress. In the classroom, we have engaged our teachers in developing a standardized formative assessment system to provide students with targeted support based on where they are in their learning journey. We are preparing an assessment committee in each of the states and at the federal level to support assessment for learning. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, we used creative models like the Unicef-supported youth polling platform, the U report, to assess learning outcomes to guide our remedial and community-based learning efforts. As a government, we see the value of data and assessment to steer what happens daily in classrooms and as a tool to enable systematic transformation. This is by no means an easy task. It requires a high level of technical capacity at the federal, at the state, and local government levels, and even in the schools. We again invite all our partners to work hand in hand with us in order to scale, upgrade appropriate acquisition of foundational literacy and numeracy for every child and young person in Nigeria. I thank you very much. And I call upon Honorable Victor Godoy, the Minister of Education, Brazil, to give us his paper on increasing catch-up and remedial education. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Minister. Good afternoon, ministers, authorities, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be here today. I'd like to thank for the opportunity to talk in this selected audience and to share with you some ideas and actions that are taking place in Brazil, showing our political commitment to overcome this challenge. Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world in terms of territory. It has more than 220 million inhabitants. Currently, basic education alone has around 46 million students, 178,000 schools, and near 2.2 million teachers. This May, we launched our national policy for the learning recovery. Using partnerships and cost-effective measures, we addressed a comprehensive approach to allow the acceleration of the learning recovery with the use of technology as an ally. We made available to all Brazilian schools and students the Diagnostic and Formative assessment platform. It establishes a continuous process with 4 assessment cycles per year, covering all students and comprising the curricular components of Portuguese language, mathematics, natural sciences, English as a second language, Portuguese fluency, and textual production capabilities. The 600 assessment tests cover the entire stage of basic education, the primary and secondary levels. This allows us to monitor students' performance during the year and to define a personalized strategy with in-time pedagogical intervention. Personalized learning follow-up is an approach that adjusts teachers' instruction levels by reorganizing students into small groups suggested by our platform with similar learning difficulties. This aim is to act on students' learning level, reducing inequalities and helping them to overcome the learning gaps. The first assessment cycle involved 5 million students in more than 2,000 municipalities, and the result depicts the size of our challenge, as more than 55% of third-grade students are not able to read, and more than 70% of them do not have the fundamental numeracy skills. At this moment, we are concluding the second assessment cycle. Looking to the future of education, the initiative includes innovative actions. For instance, an application that uses artificial intelligence to correct texts produced by students, as well as to support pedagogical paths planning. The developed application can transform handwritten text into digital text and perform automatic correction in terms of spelling, textual coherence, among other aspects. Another application that uses AI is the early warning system, which enables schools to proactively identify students at high risk of dropping out of school and provide customized interventions while students are still in school. This is a comprehensive solution that we are planning to launch next month. The teacher training to work with innovative practices is essential for successful educational inclusion. In this sense, the Brazil Ministry of Education offers continuous education courses that are 100% online and free, aligned with the Brazilian curriculum and to the pedagogical use of technologies. And we also offers courses in subjects as technology, innovation, social skills, mental health, well-being, and others. Nowadays, we have more than 3.6 million enrollments in our courses, a relevant increase when comparing to the 60,000 before the pandemic situation. The success of this recovering policy will allow us to reduce poverty and inequalities, preparing our students to access VET, higher education, and lifelong learning. We are committed to taking our country towards more social and economic development throughout the improvement of our educational system. I would like to thank the World Bank for being a partner in many educational policies in Brazil, as well as all other international partners. The time to fulfill the right for education for all students is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. In speaking about bridging the learning gap in Brazil, you know, in Nigeria, we were helped by the school feeding program, and I just thought probably you will at least mention Bolsa Familia, whether it has been a very good help to you and whether people should copy it. Thank you.
Okay, we have this national program, the federal program, which is called nowadays Auxílio Brasil, Brazilian Aid, which give families with low income some resources. And as a requirement to receive those resources, families must guarantee that their children are in school. So this helped us to get to near universalize the access to students in schools. And now we have improved the program so that we can also incentivize the development of their successful path. So we can give additional resources if their children are getting good results in schools. So it's a very interesting program that is increased, improved last year. That helped us to improve the access, and now we're looking forward to improve the quality of the offer of education.
The Minister of Education Mongolia is not here. He is represented by Ms. Sanjabadan, Scientific Secretary of Research Institute of the Ministry of Education and Science. She has the floor. Is she here?
Thank you. Our minister is just landing in Paris, and I'm trying to introduce our station on this context. And first of all, we thank this opportunity to share our experience, and we are trying to get the very good experience which is we can use in our context. And the learning is a priority policy in Mongolia. It's defined as a heart of education developed goals 2030. As technology evolves, learning goes beyond what we use to understand, and it is not the concept written in the programs, curricula, or what teachers teach in the classrooms. COVID-19 has profoundly affected people, in particular children and youth learning in Mongolia. We diagnosed the school children how much they have lost during the school closure. The results indicated that they didn't learn almost 1/3 of what they are supposed to learn. To recover from this loss, we have been implementing first learning recovery plan focusing on 3R. Reconnect with what students already learned, recovery what they didn't learn, and resilience what they are learning. Second, enabling all students more learning opportunities outside the classroom. We promote digital learning and open resources and cooperation with EdTech sector in Mongolia. Thanks to this digital system, all students can learn from the best qualified teachers in Mongolia after the regular classes. This is cognitive loss we are somehow able to bear with. After the COVID, we encountered another challenge related to children, mental health and social-emotional learning. Being unable to meet the classmates for the extended period or engage in extracurricular school or community activities, children experienced feeling of loneliness, spend more time looking at the screens to the loneliness, develop anxiety and fear and worried about lagging in the learning. For example, 56.2% of school children have low adaptability skills and showing symptoms of reacting attachment disorder, such as aggressive behavior, stress, frustration, blaming, or the hypersensitivity. While exploring the children's social-emotional state, relationships, and emotions, we found that 1/3 students experienced problems with family relationships, and 1 in 3 experienced problems with the friendship during the school closure. Indeed, in the school environment, children not only learn cognitive skills, but also, most importantly, soft skills such as communicating, interacting peer and teachers, hanging with their friends, and expressing themselves, sharing feelings, empathy, compassion, etc. During the school closure, they have totally lost 3 opportunities of learning. Thus, we allocated school psychologists, promoted social-emotional learning activities, and implemented school prevention policy from the bullying. Moreover, in cooperation with the EdTech companies, we promoted psychological support applications, and it enabled students and parents to discuss about the showing sign of the mental health and understand some ways to prevent from the issue. At present, we identified some significant changes in children and social-emotional environment within the school context. School psychologists also work with teachers and handled the mental issue. That some outcomes are context in this time, and we hope we can build a new education system in the new world, and we will together for this goal. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think Central Africa has spoken about reaching and retaining learners. Sierra Leone, prioritizing teaching and fundamentals. Brazil, increasing catch-up and remedial education. Mongolia, developing health and psychosocial well-being of students. In Nigeria, we spoke about assisted learning. On behalf of UNESCO and all the great people who are gathered here, I would like to thank my panelists and then head of national delegations and all those who accompanied them for a very good evening to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. So just, thank you very much, Your Excellency. So just as we're wrapping up, I'll just ask for people just to hold on for just a couple more minutes. We just have a couple other wrapping up comments. Can I pass to the Minister of Education from Niger, please? You have the floor. Please, sir. Your Excellency.
Merci beaucoup, Excellence. Mesdames et Messieurs, à vos titres et grades respectifs. En septembre prochain, le secrétariat général de l'Organisation des Nations Unies compte organiser à son siège de New York le sommet sur la transformation de l'éducation afin de répondre à la crise des apprentissages nés de mutations sociales, culturelles, politiques et technologiques. Cette crise se manifeste essentiellement par l'insuffisance et ou l'inadaptation des apprentissages scolaires face aux besoins des pays et des populations. Mon pays, le Niger, fait face à plusieurs mutations, parmi lesquelles nous pouvons retenir les défis démographiques, avec une population passée de 3 millions en 1960 à 24 millions en 2022, à cause essentiellement d'un taux d'accroissement de 3,9% par an et d'indice synthétique de fécondité de 7,6 enfants par femme. Cette situation démographique produit chaque année près d'1 million d'enfants en âge d'être scolarisés dans un pays aux ressources assez limitées, ce qui se traduit au Niger par une forte demande en éducation, de faibles taux de scolarisation, des classes à effectifs très élevés. Le défi climatique ou du changement climatique qui impacte négativement l'agriculture, l'élevage, la pêche, qui constituent les principales activités de près de 80% de la population nigérienne. Ce changement climatique appauvrit les populations et les rend incapables de se nourrir, de subvenir à la scolarisation de leurs enfants. Le troisième défi, c'est le défi sécuritaire qui provoquent tantôt des fermetures des écoles, tantôt des délocalisations des écoles, avec le coroner de sous-scolarisation, de perte de temps d'apprentissage, de désordre psychologique et social. Par la rencontre d'aujourd'hui, nous allons à la conquête de l'éducation ou l'utopie nécessaire que Jacques Delors annonçait dans son livre « L'éducation, un trésor est caché dedans », paru en 1999 sous l'égide de l'UNESCO. Dans la même décennie, dans l'avant-propos du livre de Joseph Kizerbo, « Éduquer ou périr », paru en 1990, on peut lire « Pour relever les multiples défis en cette fin de siècle, il importe de s'appuyer sur des leviers puissants capables de faire basculer les lourds obstacles qui barrent le chemin vers l'accomplissement de leur destin des diverses communautés humaines. » C'est le sens de l'appel lancé à tous les pays, à tout le peuple et à tous les citoyens du monde en faveur de l'éducation pour tous. En effet, le pré-sommet doit extraire de l'école le trésor caché afin de faire de cette institution séculaire un outil de promotion grâce à ces extrants que je nomme les apprentissages. Or, ces derniers sont en dessous aujourd'hui de nos espérances, aussi les qualifie-t-on de pauvres. Oui, les acquis ou les apprentissages sont pauvres car ils ne nous permettent pas de vivre correctement. Tout comme un faible revenu empêche l'accès aux ressources matérielles nécessaires au bien-être. Mesdames et messieurs, chers participants, en 1961, les États africains optèrent pour une scolarisation universelle à l'horizon 1980. À la fin des échéances, peu de pays peuvent prétendre atteindre la cible. Seule la Tanzanie de Julius Nyerere et le Kenya de Jomo Kenyatta semblent être les bons élèves. Après le sommet de Djamtien en Thaïlande en 1990 et celui de Dakar au Sénégal en avril 2000, la communauté internationale, sous le leadership de l'UNESCO, s'engage dans l'éducation pour tous, ou EPT, concomitamment avec les OMD, afin de scolariser les enfants de l'humanité à l'horizon 2010-2013. Et des pays peu scolarisés comme le Niger élaborent des programmes décennaux. À l'échéance, l'objectif n'est pas encore atteint. En 2015, l'humanité se propose de sauver sa planète avec 17 objectifs dits de développement durable ou ODD à l'horizon 2030. Parmi ces ODD, le numéro 4 est spécifique à l'éducation. C'est à l'aune de cet ODD 4 et ces 17 cibles qu'il faut comprendre la pauvreté des apprentissages. Son Excellence Mohamed Bazoum, président de la République du Niger, disait dans son discours d'ouverture, parlant du Niger, « Si je considère le défi de l'éducation comme notre plus grand défi, c'est parce que je sais que le faible taux de scolarité et le taux élevé des échecs scolaires ont pour effet de priver des contingents très nombreux d'enfants et de jeunes réelles chances d'éducation. » Mesdames et messieurs, les grands pédagogues de tous les temps ont admis que l'éducation est un transfert de savoir des adultes vers la jeunesse ou des détenteurs de savoir vers ceux qui en sont dépourvus et qui en ont besoin. Ce transfert de savoir assure la construction ou la mise en place des hommes et des femmes dont la société a besoin pour fonctionner. Aujourd'hui, on parle de capital, de production de capital humain. Son Excellence Mohamed Bazoum ne dit-il pas, conformément à mon engagement décliné dans mon discours d'investiture, je travaille à relever notre système éducatif afin qu'il soit en mesure de générer le capital humain dont notre économie a besoin. Ce transfert a lieu au moyen de deux actes humains. Les anciens enseignent et les jeunes apprennent. On obtient alors le couple enseignement-apprentissage. Un apprentissage est dit pauvre quand ce transfert se trouve dans des situations particulières comme quand dans un système éducatif, les jeunes ou apprenants acquièrent peu d'apprentissage, Quand dans un système éducatif, peu de jeunes accèdent aux apprentissages, quand les apprentissages ne sont pas pertinents au vu de la situation du pays, des populations et des communautés. Mesdames et messieurs, la pauvreté des apprentissages ou learning poverty n'est pas un fait de hasard, non plus un fait conjoncturel. Cette pauvreté est structurelle, économique et culturelle. Dans mon pays, la pauvreté des apprentissages est mesurée par des niveaux atteints par les élèves en français, langue officielle et langue d'enseignement aujourd'hui. Et en mathématiques, et les résultats issus des enquêtes nationales et internationales relèvent qu'en 2019, en lecture, 70% des élèves du primaire au Niger en fin de cycle n'ont pas atteint le niveau suffisant de maîtrise des compétences en lecture. En mathématiques, 77,5% des élèves du primaire au Niger en fin de cycle n'ont pas atteint le niveau suffisant de maîtrise des compétences en mathématiques. Chers participants, au Niger, cette situation peut s'expliquer par le faible niveau de compétences professionnelles des enseignants, une insuffisance des intrants comme les manuels, les fournitures scolaires, les laboratoires, les matériels pédagogiques ou didactiques. Un environnement scolaire peu propice aux apprentissages violents et non sécurisés. Face à cette situation, le pays envisage la relecture des programmes d'enseignement du cycle primaire en attendant la généralisation de nouveaux curriculums en expérimentation par l'introduction des langues nationales dès les premières classes de l'enseignement primaire. La professionnalisation des enseignants et l'élaboration d'une politique enseignante. La construction des classes pour remplacer progressivement les classes en paillotes et des internats pour jeunes filles. L'optimisation des temps d'apprentissage par un système de monitoring du temps scolaire, la prise en charge efficace de l'éducation en situation d'urgence dans les zones affectées par les conflits, les crises et autres catastrophes, crises sanitaires liées à la pandémie du Covid, l'inondation, etc. L'intégration des TIS pour améliorer la qualité de l'éducation. Mesdames et messieurs, ce prosommet est pour les États, surtout sous-scolarisés comme le Niger, un terreau d'échange, mais aussi d'espoir. Il y a plus de 2 siècles, en 1797, Pestalozzi nous disait « Maintenant que l'homme est appelé à se conquérir son bien-être à la faveur de son savoir et de son savoir-faire, il y a nécessité d'organiser le transfert de connaissances. Ainsi est né au berceau de la modernité le système d'enseignement. Ce pré-sommet et le sommet proprement dit ont la lourde mission de replacer l'école et l'éducation dans leur mission authentique. En effet, les péripéties de l'histoire des peuples et des nations, la marchandisation des savoirs, les égoïsmes et les rivalités étatiques ont conduit l'humanité à perdre l'éducation. À cet instant précis, nos pensées vont à ces milliers d'enfants et d'adultes incapables de lire, mais vivant dans un monde de technologies avancées. Ces adultes et ces jeunes sont devenus de proie à l'analphabétisme. Leur avenir semble compromis. Faisons en sorte que d'autres sur notre planète ne s'y ajoutent. C'est pourquoi le Niger pense s'adresser à une communauté internationale audible, humaine et humaniste. Vive l'éducation, vive la coopération internationale. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Excellency. A final word, Minister Shockey, please.
Well, it has been an amazing meeting, very fruitful. I can only reflect on the comments by Ms. Amina, Deputy Secretary General the United Nations, by Rob and Catherine, by Jaime, Stefania, very, very useful, by honorable ministers. I guess we agree on everybody facing the same problem. Solutions are coming up everywhere. We have a problem to solve, as Jaime said, and action is now. There are many things we can discuss. I know time is running. We have achieved a lot of things in Egypt, as I tried to say, and I only said tiny bit of it. I was very impressed by what I heard in Brasilia, in other countries around the world. And I guess one thing I hope the international agencies can help with is to champion those projects that we can share and we can build on each other instead of being fragmented. There are many things we listen to now today with the help of technology also. We can really share a lot of things. We can share digital content, we can share assessment platforms, we can share curricula, we can share know-how. There is common core, math and science, we can all share, and resources will not be a barrier, Jaime, as you eloquently said, but the know-how we all gained from the crisis can help us move forward with the speed you're hoping. So thank you, everybody, and let's go for more fun for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. A contribution from Joyce, please. The floor is yours, Joyce Bennett.
I'm going to be very brief. Good afternoon. I'm Judith Herbertson from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. As we've heard, COVID-19 has exacerbated the learning crisis way faster than we could have predicted. But this session has shown us that the global education sector has both the opportunity and the ambition to reboot. If all of us, as of next Monday, and all those we work with, start working towards these goals with the urgency that we know the crisis requires. And excitantly, as shown by the countries who have spoken this afternoon, we do know what we need to do. For every child to achieve the full range of skills they need for life, work, and sustainable development, we need to prioritise building foundational skills first. And as part of this, the UK has endorsed by the G7 as well last year 2 SDG 4 milestone global goals to improve foundational learning for all by 2026. Namely, to get 40 million more girls into school than would otherwise have been there, and 20 million more girls reading by the age of 10. As part of accelerating the action we've heard about to 2030, and also to learn what works. As we were hearing now, we don't want to fragment, we want to learn what success looks like. And we're aiming to achieve this in 4 ways. Firstly, ensuring that we understand how children can catch up on lost learning and how to equip them with the basic skills: literacy, numeracy, learning how to learn. Secondly, getting behind country-led initiatives to get more girls in school safe and learning. Thirdly, generating global data, evidence and analysis to promote education system reform. And lastly, promoting innovative financing solutions that will help us bridge the enormous financing gap. And as some of you may have heard me say this morning, and I forgive me for repeating it, we need to hold ourselves accountable by keeping our focus on what we call that girl. Born in poverty, in crisis, in a remote rural area, perhaps in a refugee camp, maybe disabled, maybe malnourished after the pandemic, but very much the hardest to reach, facing layers of discrimination. And if we can open the doors to education for that girl through foundational learning so that she can thrive, we'll know we can succeed. And then we need to do the same for every boy and every girl globally. I look forward very much to reading the full commitment to action and exploring how the UK can support it. And I am feeling much more confident that we're going to be able to do this by this stage of the day than I was this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judith. So just for me to close, thank you all for your participation, your commitment, your engagement, your amazing ideas. Look forward to the continued discussion. Wishing you all best for the next couple of days. Thank you.
number of colleagues who you see beside me who will be making short remarks. A number of you have come prepared to share some of your experiences and your insights from your countries and your agencies. But we're very much looking forward also to a conversation in the room. I think to be transformative in respect of any aspect of education, but particularly this, we need to crowd in all of your support, all of your insights, all of your experiences. So in the short time that we have before you start, I would like to invite you all to think about, from your perspective, what is the most transformative thing that you could think about, the single thing that you're looking for the international community and for others to support to give access to quality education for more children affected by crisis and emergencies around the world. So with that, we'll pause in a second and we'll start formally, but that's a little bit of homework in advance of the session so that we can all participate. I look forward to that in just a moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the official start now, and so thank you for being here. It's absolutely amazing to see so many familiar faces, to be joined by so many friends, and above all, to be joined by so many staunch advocates for the right of children caught up in crisis, caught up in emergencies, to continue their education. So, I don't need to tell any of you why we're here, which is, of course, at the Secretary-General's invitation. He's asked the international community to come together and to reflect on and commit to what more can be done to accelerate the achievement of SDG 4 in general, but of course, in particular reference to and in response to the setback that was caused by COVID, the closure of schools, the disruption that occurred. But of course, we all know that disruption that continues to occur and sadly actually only grows is the disruption of humanitarian crises that affect children's right to education in so many ways. And just last week, in fact, our colleagues from Education Cannot Wait did some groundbreaking work on the announcement of a new number, which details that, in fact, there are in fact 222 million children around the world in need of educational support because of the impact of humanitarian crises on their education. It's actually been a big month for reports because earlier than that, our colleagues at the Global Coalition for the Protection of Education ATTACK launched a report that demonstrated an unprecedented number of attacks on education and threats to educational staff and facilities. And another report which kind of complements that picture that was launched just last week by our colleagues at the Geneva Hub for Education in Emergencies analysed funding flows to education and demonstrates the huge financial gaps that exist in providing support to children in emergencies. So I think that, and we'll hear a little bit more about each of those reports and those details, but they set the scene, I think, for our discussion today, which is how in that context, with growing needs, huge financing gaps, and significant threats to education, can we harness the opportunity that is before us today and in the lead up to September and beyond to accelerate education for those children who are affected by crises. So in order to do that today and have that discussion, I'm going to call on a number of people who are sitting beside me to make very short remarks to help set the scene from their perspective. And then we are going to move to a couple of other interventions from our colleagues, and then we're going to have an open discussion. And I really do want to make it discursive, so I'm going to invite everyone who speaks to be as brief as possible, because we have to make not just education inclusive, but the conversation about it inclusive. So we want to hear from as many people in the room who want to speak as possible. And that I invite everyone to make their remarks very action-orientated as well. So short, brief, to the point, and action-focused is the invitation. So, without further ado, I'm going to now call upon the host of all of us, the host of this meeting today. We're in her house, the Assistant Director General from UNESCO, my good friend, Stefania Giannini.
Thank you very much, dear Joe, and it's a great pleasure, Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome all of you to this important side event, a side meeting, and to first of all express my deep appreciation for the great cooperation we are having in the sector around an essential topic. I mean, education in emergencies is not a nice topic to add when we have a list of priorities. It's very much related to the learning crisis and the disruption of education that the entire world is living, for the multiple crises that actually jeopardize in the present and the future. So I think it's quite timely to discuss about this important component of the right to education. It's quite timely to take collective responsibility to move the agenda on. It's quite timely in this pre-summit to take some commitments, which is also the job we are requested to do to lead up to the summit in September in New York. Having said that, education cannot wait. First of all, UNHCR, Unicef and GPE are really very much on top of this priority with us, and this is really cooperation in action to address one of the gravest and most extensive violations of the right to education now, and I very appreciate that. Well, our great moderator already set the scene, so I repeat I recall some milestone reports and, still outcomes of our collective action just to fine-tune a bit the discussion. We know that conflicts are increasingly protracted as well as climate-related shocks, which are more intense and frequent than ever. And we know a record high number of people around the world displaced within their own countries. Every crisis actually affects education head-on. This is the common red line we see in all these different situations. For over 4 months, we have witnessed repeated attacks against schools and educational institutions in Ukraine. This is the last in the chronology of the main crisis. The 2022 Education Under Attack, published by the Global Coalition to Protect Education Under Attack, already mentioned, this month chronicles around 5,000 incidents of attacks on education and cases of military use of schools, with some 9,000 students and educators being abducted, arrested, injured, or killed. According to ECW and her tireless leader, my dear friend Yasmin Sharif, who's sitting with us today, the latest figures show, I have this number in mind because I was part of the video promotion of this for the commitment to this topic. 222 million children and youth either have their education disrupted or not learning due to the same challenges. And the number which is most most importantly, the number is more than double the number previously referenced. So it's a kind of trend which is going on. On the funding front, already mentioned still by our moderator today, the flagship report published earlier this month by the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, which UNESCO is proud to be part, clearly pointed out the remains chronically underfunded against the backdrop of these rapidly increasing needs. In the UN humanitarian appeals, education in emergencies received only 22% of the funds requested last year. So keeping these figures in mind, I think that we are all aware that it's about denying millions of children and youth of their right to education, and it's simply putting SDG4 at risk of not being achieved, among other issues we are discussing very much in this intensive Peace Summit days. This week, I think we have a tremendous, unique opportunity. That's a bit my last message. It's about managing complexity. It's about making choices, of course, to what should be addressed first, better, more. It's about intensifying our joint efforts. But I'm sure that this issue, education in emergencies and all related topics that we have to address, including financing across the triple nexus of humanitarian, development, and peace-building actors and initiatives, will be one of the topics coming out from this pre-summit to lead up to New York. UNESCO has a long-standing experience in coordination of efforts at national, regional level. I wish to mention some of them: Afghanistan, Kenya, Yemen, Rwanda, Cambodia, Myanmar, Lebanon, Niger, Cameroon, Madagascar, Ukraine now. We are very much proudly part of the UN system to give back to these children the same right they have as all other children who are not in a conflict situation. And we know also that we have 8 years in front of us, at least, to meet 2030 expectations and commitment. And we need to move now. I think the previous section in this room had this kind of warning message. The time is now to act, the time is now to coordinate, the time is now to call for commitment. I think that we have all the conditions to do that, and for sure UNESCO is part of these collective efforts and is taking its responsibility. I thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Madam Assistant Director General, thank you. That was a terrific way of setting the scene for us, setting out all of those challenges, and I very much thank you for that. I know it's often very hard, and you mentioned a number of the places in the world where there are crises, and you brought particular attention to the dreadful situation facing Ukraine, which is having a huge impact on educational facilities and access. But I also wanted to use the opportunity, particularly because as a member state, they're not here for obvious reasons, to draw attention whilst we are and can to the situation in Afghanistan, obviously. And the crisis that affects that country, and of course continues to exclude, in particular, girls from secondary education. And I know Yasmin has been there and could no doubt speak to that, and that's an issue that we're all interested in. But I think it's worth acknowledging the gravity of that situation, along with the gravity of others situations that you mentioned. And we will, in fact, have an opportunity to hear from ministers of education from some countries that are themselves deeply affected by crisis. So in response to this issue, at the World Humanitarian Summit some time ago, the international community did come together, and it did something really quite remarkable. It established a new agency with responsibility for this very question, education in emergencies, in the form of Education Cannot Wait, the Global Fund for Education in Emergencies. It's done terrific work since its inception and creation, and we'll hear a little bit about that now from its Executive Director, Yasmin Sharif.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And let me also thank my dear friend, also the host, Stefania Giannanini, and also congratulate you. I think that the pre-summit is a good promise of what will take place in September. Really well done to UNESCO. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and also my peers in the panel, and colleagues and friends. Now, as the Assistant Secretary General of UNESCO, Stefania Giannini, just mentioned, and also the chair of the panel, Joseph, we just came up with the research using a whole different methodology of 222 million children and youth in conflicts settings affected by armed conflict, by climate-induced disasters, as refugees having fled crossed an international border, and as internally displaced, who all of them, on top of it, were affected by COVID-19. We are speaking an unprecedented, historically unprecedented number of 222 million children and youth today. And the methodology was used is covered by all in the education sector. While it was carried out by Education Cannot Wait, we are the United Nations Global Fund for Education in Emergencies and Protracted Crisis. It was validated by the Education in Emergency Reference Group, which is co-chaired by UNESCO, composed of Unicef, UNHR, a number of civil society organizations, INNE, the International Network for Education in Emergencies, and many others. The best of the experts in the education community validated it. So we all own this number. And we all own the 222 million children and youth, their right to realize their dream. Or as the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated on the day we released the number, since the upcoming Transforming Education Summit is the Secretary General Summit, he stated, we need governments, business foundations, and individual support to the vital work of Education Cannot Wait, to help place education within the reach of every child, everywhere. Help us keep 222 million dreams alive. Now, you are a child or a young person on the border between Somalia and Ethiopia, in the Rohingya refugee camps, in Gaza, in the Sahel, in Mali, fleeing as an internally displaced or a refugee from Venezuela. You lost everything, everything. You lost your homes, your family, your trust and faith in the international community. You only have one dream left, and that is to get a good quality education, to rise out of that suffering and be a positive, productive world citizen. We cannot let them down. This is serious, serious, serious. Now, let me say, the most transformative, I believe, my team at Education Cannot Wait believes, and I think all of us who are part of the broader Education Cannot Wait platform, because we are in this together, the most transformative we can do, and then we can subcategorize the transformation, but the most transformative we can do now is to translate commitment into real, tangible action. And this is what we hope to see in September. We need to look at the context. We are speaking about the context of the most extreme human suffering. It's not just COVID-19. It's not extreme poverty alone, which already is bad enough. It's all the violence. It's all the losses for a human being, all the loss of hope. We are speaking about the most abnormal circumstances on earth when we speak about EIE. The content, what does the young people today want to learn? What do they need to learn to tell their story? Because education is about telling your story one day to the world through the means that you are educated, whether it's social emotional learning, whether it is math or literacy skill or art and so forth. What is the kind of education today's young people need? We have to be ready to revisit the kind of curriculums that are delivered and how we teach and how we support teachers to keep up and empower them with 21st century learning and teaching. And it's about accountability to those we serve, whether it's host governments, the education ministers, struggling, marginalized in the darkest corners of the world, or it is the impoverished communities that are on the receiving end of bombs, pillage, fire, killings. How do we deliver results and ensure learning outcomes? It's not enough to sit behind a desk. What are you actually learning? And finally, and this is the most important, and that's why Education Cannot Wait exists. That's why GPE, the Global Partnership for Education, exists. That's why the International Financing Facility is about to be established. It's about financing education. I come from Sweden. I have an Egyptian name. My father was from Egypt. My mother is Swedish. $11,000 a year go to a child's learning. We are moving around in these countries that I just mentioned with about $150, $100 per child. What kind of quality education is that? So just to compare, the same goes for all OECD countries. I think the DAC figure is about 10,000 per child. Where is the financing for something that is so fundamental to address climate change, address health, address peace and stability, security, because there cannot be anything of that without first educating the young people and the children. So let me conclude. I think the most transformative we can do today is pooled funding, focusing on content, collaboration, coordination, context. Through pooled funding, all ODA governments and private sectors and youth get not only to sit by the table, but to make the actual decisions and steer us towards the solutions for the 222 million. So I think that is the answer, and I know many will agree with me around the table. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Yasmin, including for ending on that important note about financing. If we don't know, we should know that Education Cannot Wait's replenishment event is occurring in February next year. I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that. But you make the point that it's not the only vehicle by which to fund education in emergencies. Obviously, it's an important one, and we wanted to see it fully funded to meet its replenishment target. But you acknowledge that there are a variety of actors, all who need support, including, of course, our colleagues who are about to speak now from, amongst other agencies, Unicef. So So it's an important point and a great one for you to end on, and we will return to it, no doubt, throughout this session. So I should say, colleagues, the panelists are from the sponsoring agencies for this particular session. We've heard from our colleague from UNESCO, from Yasmin from Education Cannot Wait. We will hear from Unicef, UNHCR and GPE, who are also the co-sponsors for this event, before we hear from some other interventions as well. So I'd like now to hear from Rob Jenkins, UNICEF's Director of Education. Rob.
Well, thanks a lot, Joseph. Great to be here. Great to be with fellow panelists. And great to have this discussion, and thanks again for the opportunity. So I think everyone here will recognize the importance of education emergencies and reaching the most marginalized. I think we all recognize the most marginalized children live in crisis-affected countries, whether it be conflict or otherwise. But the challenge, of course, is translating that energy, that spirit, into actual action. And this is where it gets troubling, because the data is very worrying on the state of learning. I was sitting about 7 chairs over at the last session. I seem to be moving more and more. I don't know, by tomorrow I'll be right out the door. But we were talking about the challenges in foundational literacy and numeracy in general, and foundational learning. And that data is very worrying. If you take a subset of children living in crisis-affected countries, it is absolutely dreadful. We use words like a catastrophe, but I wonder why. Where is the bottleneck? Why are we collectively, translating sort of these intentions of how important we all recognize it is into actual action? So let me just take a few quick examples where it is in action. So UNICEF, as you know, is, I think most people will know, but is a very large operational agency predominantly focused on humanitarian fragile countries. We have hundreds of staff living in 14 offices in Afghanistan today, for example, around the country in Somalia, around the country mostly at subnational level, working with national organizations, community-based groups, delivering education emergencies. We do absolutely struggle with continuing to secure the funding required to support education emergencies. And Education Cannot Wait's a key partner of ours, GPE is a key partner of ours, and others, but indeed it is a struggle. And I think one of the key ingredients of success to translate the spirit into practice and mobilize the operations that are required in emergency context is leadership globally, and we're all here now offering that leadership, but I think at national and local level. When you have leaders committed to continuing to deliver education emergencies in conflict-affected areas or humanitarian context, you can see real progress. And we have some great examples. The Minister from Education from Nigeria was here in the last session. Amazing at-scale interventions in Nigeria now in some very challenging parts of the country on teaching at the right level, for example. The data is incredible. It is showing an improvement of learning against even pre-crisis levels because of the adoption of some really exciting interventions. We have, in the country I used to serve in Jordan, I don't think the minister is here in the room, but he's very much here, some incredible examples from the 5 years I was there, but it's continued in meeting the needs of refugees and displaced populations, and through a humanitarian intervention, improving the quality of the entire education system. It's really incredible results. Again, some amazing leadership in the country and a collection of organizations working together delivering. I think the triple nexus, as this session is called, is a piece of that. How do we leverage the humanitarian response and education emergencies to have medium and long-term impact, improve quality for all children? As I'm sure Joe is going to talk about, but a lot of us have also linked to that is how do we, when we intervene in education emergencies, how do we measure the impact of that on learning for all children? In the end, it comes back to improving the education services for all. And that means measuring learning and learning and its knock-on effects around social cohesion and peace building and long-term sustainability of the system. So that's where Unicef fits, right at the education emergency, kind of at the edge of the operationalization of providing services for children affected by conflict or an emergency context, but leveraging it into the nexus so that we have long-term impact. And that's something that when we see it, it really is an amazing thing to watch. Seeing emergency response turn into medium and long-term sustainable change for all children, which I think is what we're all motivated for. So count on our full support as UNICEF to continue to work with all our dear partners and friends here on the panel. Hopefully we won't have this conversation again 2 years from now, 5 years from now, with such dire statistics. I think we should not shy away from the challenge we have facing ourselves. And so again, we really like the term transformation so that we don't fall back to where we were pre-COVID or where we currently are today in really truly a devastating catastrophe situation in many contexts, and we leapfrog to a new future in which marginalized children can realize their full potential. Back to you, and thanks again for this opportunity.
Terrific, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rob. I think, you know, one of the things that we can mark up as a promising moment is the discussion around learning in emergencies that I've heard a number of people, Yasmin and Rob, to talk about today. And I know that the challenges of ensuring that children learn in low-income contexts are significant in themselves, with up to 9 out of 10 kids, even when they have access to education, are not acquiring the basic skill of being able to read a single sentence, even if they've had access to 4 years of education. And we think, well, how could that possibly be done in emergencies? But I love the fact that we're bringing the learning agenda to this conversation and acknowledging that access on its own isn't enough, even in those contexts. It's an ambitious agenda, but it's an important one. And I know that with you, Education Cannot Wait's been doing some important work on that very issue, which I think they're looking at highlighting in their next strategic period. So great stuff to really move the needle on learning, not just access in these contexts. One organisation that's really taken education for its populations very seriously is, of course, UNHCR. Education was a central pillar of the outcomes of the Global Compact on Refugees at the Global Refugee Forum some years ago. And that's very much focused on ensuring that refugees and the populations which host them have access to quality education. And that is, of course, driven by the fact that refugees flee conflict and crisis. They cross borders in an effort to find safety and security, but often also, obviously, in the hope of a better life. And education is a real driver for those movements and for the aspirations of those populations. So it's fantastic that we're going to hear today from UNHCR in the form of Sajid Malik, who is, of course, the Director of the Division of Resilience and Solutions at the UN Refugee Agency. Sajid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, UNESCO. Thank you, colleagues, for this event. When we are giving you some numbers which are a reminder that something is fundamentally wrong about what's happening. 222 million children, more conflicts, more displacements. We can also give you another number of 100 million displaced, which we had not seen before. So there is something fundamentally wrong, which we are looking at it with the perspective today from education's point of view, but there's more to it than why this displacement, why this conflicts, why all that. I mean, this is something that obviously it's not the discussion here today, but it's important that we keep that in perspective. Now, the war in Ukraine and the new internal displacement, and Yasmin has highlighted a number of them in the African context, also in the Asian continent, means that now we have crossed the 100 million mark. Again, I'm giving you a mark which is unprecedented. We have never thought that we're going to reach this number, but we are now at 100 million globally, which is not something that we even a few months ago we were thinking of that. There are 5 million more refugees today, refugees who have crossed the border than they were at the end of 2021. Ukraine, 6 million refugees now, they have crossed the border and they are in neighboring countries. So it's already been 7 years since Rohingya people fled for Bangladesh. Yasmin highlighted that. And 8 years since 6 million Venezuelans sought international protection. If existing education financing mechanisms explicitly, reflexively, and predictably provided for refugees and others forcibly displaced people and communities that host them, that would have long been enough for young refugees to complete their basic education. Most have not. It's been more than a decade since large-scale crises in Somalia, South Sudan, and Syria drove record numbers of people to seek international protection. If financing mechanisms were truly transformational, then refugees from those countries might have been able to complete their secondary education. Most have not. If the nexus functioned as we all know it could and must, at least 3 generations of Afghan refugees might have been eligible for post-secondary academic or professional studies, or having received a full formal education. Perhaps 2 generations of Afghan refugees might have returned home educated to rebuild their country, but they have not. Refugee children and youth are amongst the most likely to be left behind educationally. They are not statistically visible. They are not in their own countries. They are in another country, which is not often recognizing them or the inclusion of in the education system. Without them, the goal of the SDG will never be met. A systemic approach in each member state is needed to address the reality of growing levels of forced displacement, whilst ensuring meaningfully responsibility sharing across the international community in line with the Global Compact on Refugees. UNHCR is grateful that a growing number of countries are including refugees in their national education systems. But host countries need more than goodwill to support those students so that they can be productive members of the society and, when situation permits, return home and reverse the effects of crisis that made them flee. During an emergency, the speed and agility of an emergency education response is essential for minimizing disruptions to the education of refugee children and youth. And you've heard from my colleagues, Unicef and Yasmin. Education Cannot Wait has supported such responses repeatedly. But emergency response for education is inadequate for the trend of protracted displacement. Afghan refugees, Syrian refugees, these are 20, 30 years. Can we continue running them with emergency education? The nexus we have all been talking about since the days of the General Bargain has not evolved, Grand Bargain, sorry, has not evolved sufficiently. The focus on supporting refugee-inclusive national education systems committed to in the Global Compact on Refugees requires a tangible commitment to the responsibility sharing that the Compact also always sets out. Mid- and long-term inclusion of displaced children and youth in national education systems needs to be incentivized across all humanitarian and development assistance mechanisms. And the step change between mechanisms must be resolved for the nexus to become functional. The World Bank and UNHCR calculate the annual cost of giving refugee children quality education within national systems at $4.85 billion, an amount which must be built into global financing plans. This will only be possible through the mobilization of adequate, predictable, multi-year financing matched to country needs, including international aid, innovative financing, and fiscal space expansion. We call on member states to advocate for such measures. A healthy nexus means that refugee hosting countries are positioned to include refugees in their education sector plans and budgets within an annual school cycle. This can be achieved through joint needs analysis, policy dialogue, planning, and concessional financing mechanisms that reinforce the incentive towards an inclusive approach to refugees and an enabling policy environment. A year ago, if you had asked a Ukrainian citizen where they would be today, the chances they would have answer Poland, Romania, Moldova, Hungary, or Slovakia would have been minimal. 11 years ago, if you had asked the same question to a Syrian refugee when they would return home from Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Sudan, or many other countries, they might have told you soon, in a week, in a month. It's 11 years. Nothing prepares you, and yet education must. Give children the same rights to realize their dreams. It has to go beyond emergency. It's protracted. It has to go more than just a Band-Aid. It needs to be more longer term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sajjad, for sharing all of that, both the compelling needs that you set out, but also many of the practical solutions which you say are there, but which need to be mobilized and supported. I know that the Global Partnership for Education is key to some of that. It supports countries to both develop and then finance their education sector plans. And I know it wants to and encourages countries to think about how those plans can include refugees. So it's doing some of that work. And I am reminded by virtue of the commonality that we are here. So at the Global Refugee Forum, in fact, our colleagues from the World Bank who are here, GPE, UNESCO, Unicef, and of course Education Wait, committed to work on the delivery of exactly that, those commitments that were forming part of the Global Compact on Refugees. And I hope this moment and the Transforming Education Summit is a moment to accelerate that commitment and that action by all of those agencies together. And no doubt we will hear a little bit about that from Joe Bourne from the Global Partnership for Education. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks to all the speakers before me who I think have said all of the important points. But thanks also for mentioning, of course, the joint commitment that we have, in particular, the pledge to refugees and accelerating that. It's clear all of us here have a deep conviction that equitable, inclusive, resilient education systems are critical to building peaceful, prosperous and fair societies. And yet the number of children and adolescents, as we've heard, who need education support in these contexts is shockingly high. It's an undeniable threat to the right of each and every child to education, but also a red flag for the future of communities and countries. So the foundation for protecting children's rights to education must be laid long before a crisis happens. It needs to be sustained, that right, during conflicts and disasters, and then hardwired into recovery and peace. This means building and protecting education systems that can reach the most vulnerable children, withstand shocks, and adapt new challenges whilst keeping that all-important focus on learning and learning for the future. Most of you know that GP primarily works with national governments, but not only, and I'll come to that in a second. And more than half of our 80 lower-income partner countries are affected by conflict and fragility, and all of them are facing the impacts of climate change, increasing food prices, rising debts, and learning loss due to COVID. Many of those countries have huge aspirations to include everybody in their education systems, to focus on learning, to introduce a wide range of skills for the future, and yet they struggle to get the support system-wide implementation of those aspirations. And so GPE as a partnership is committed to working with them to do that. And how do we do that? Firstly, by embedding crisis preparedness into education planning, including ensuring refugees are included in national planning and budgeting, and ensuring a focus on the most marginalised children of our support. And this includes working with countries to protect and increase education budgets and finance that reaches those that need it most. And I think, as the previous speaker said, it would actually only take a very small amount of national budgets to reach all the refugees in those countries which are hosting the large number of refugees. So that national commitment from governments is absolutely critical to do that. Secondly, we focus relentlessly on equity and inclusion of the most marginalised children, including girls, of course, given that they're disproportionately affected by crisis. We know education can be a force for peace and mutual understanding, but it can also be a force for the contrary if systems exclude some learners systematically or provide opportunities and resources inequitably. So to be effective, our investments need to address those root causes of vulnerability and that two-way interaction between education and conflict and hardwiring the gender responsiveness throughout that. Thirdly, we adapt what we do to context. And Yasmin talked about context, I think a number of people, as being absolutely essential. This includes providing flexible, accelerated funding to countries to respond to emergency situations such as food crisis, floods, COVID. And in the rare cases where we are unable to work with governments, GPE takes a principles-led approach to safeguarding children's rights to education, preventing system collapse, and aligning with the UN and humanitarian principles and actors to coherently support locally determined plans and activities. So, for example, in Afghanistan, we're making available $300 million to support activities within the country's humanitarian response plan and Afghanistan education sector transitional framework. We're working closely with ECW to promote alignment with ECW's multi-year resilience programme. And Myanmar, similarly, we're freeing up resources where there is a very long history of strong coordination between development and humanitarian actors. So we're supporting those efforts around the joint response framework, which partners developed following the coup. And in both cases, we're expecting that finance to reach the children who need it most, and that is the priority. So for my cloning point is, GPE is a partnership, so many of you in the room are either on our board or are part of our partners or work with us closely on the ground. Civil society, governments, multilaterals, bilaterals, private sectors and foundations. And you ask, what do we need? I'm going to echo what everybody else has said. I think that together, we do know how to work across this nexus. We do know how to coordinate at country level, because that's where it matters. But there is a chronic lack of financing, and that's both domestic financing and international financing for education, but particularly for education for these particular groups of children in the most difficult situations.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jo. And I know that we'll want to return to some of those opportunities that you set out in respect of greater collaboration and engagement across the partners. We're going to move now to two final interventions from the panel, slightly different in form, and then we're going to open it up. And I would say too that we haven't thus far heard from a government, from a member state. So I'm delighted that we're going to hear from Heike Kuhn from Germany, and then we're also going to hear from the Deputy Commissioner General at UNRWA. And we're going to start with her remarks. And we're doing that because UNRWA is the only UN agency that is actually responsible for the delivery of an education system, in this instance to Palestinian refugees. So unlike other UN agencies, they have that responsibility and obviously, like many member states, have many challenges in respect of that, but are facing those challenges by innovation and commitment, which we're going to hear a little bit about from now. And so I invite Stenseth to speak, the Deputy Commissioner General from UNRWA.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, Assistant Director General, ladies and gentlemen. As you will be aware, and as was also mentioned by the Chair, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, as we call it, has a unique mandate. We run the single largest education system in the UN. We provide government-like services for millions of Palestine refugees living in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We are mandated to deliver on SDG 4 for the Palestine refugee population. And every day, close to 500,000 kids attend UNRWA schools. We have more than 700 schools operating across our 5 fields. We have 8,000 youth attending our TVET centers and over 2,000 teachers attending our teaching colleges in our fields. So we have more than 22,000 education staff, including 18,000 teachers. And I'm mentioning these numbers because it says something about the capacity we have to deliver on education in crisis situations in the field we operate in. So we run an education system on the size of a small country. And through our schools, millions of Palestine children across generations have received high-quality education. It was, when it was incepted in 1949, a nexus organization already. But as an agency, and not as a government, we do not have the fiscal tools that the government has. We rely almost exclusively on voluntary contribution. And sometimes we live month by month, not being sure if we can pay our teachers their salaries the next month. In delivering education, we have partnered with UNESCO through an historic partnership that's run ever since 1950. Or emergency or education in emergency program has also gained a lot of respect across the region. In 4 of our 5 fields, in addition to the chronic and protected crisis, there's an ongoing emergency. From the conflict in Syria, cycles of violence in Gaza, the pandemic, the unprecedented economic and financial crisis in Lebanon, the occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, we constantly have to adapt our education program to an ever-changing operational context. And we apply a 3-tier approach to education in emergencies. Our first priority is always to enable a safe and secure learning environment for Palestine refugee children and youth. And second, to offer alternative methods of teaching and learning in times of crisis. As an example, I would like to mention the digital learning platform that we established in 2021 as a response to the pandemic, an invention that now proves very relevant when we are facing ongoing crisis, cycles of violence in many of our fields, where we will enable the children to access learning digitally when there is intermediate crisis ongoing in the different fields where we operate. And third, we encourage parental, community and student engagement to support the quality and continuation of education in emergencies. And this consultation with the community we find is as key when we have acute emergencies. UNRWA is the triple nexus in action. We have a mandate to deliver education to Palestine refugee population until a just and lasting solution is found. This is about human development. And our commitment and our ability to continue to offer quality education during acute and protracted crisis links our human development mandate with our humanitarian mandate. And further, access to education, and education that promotes peace, provides stability, and it furthers peace. And as the preamble to the Constitution of UNESCO states, it is in the minds of women and men that wars begin, and is therefore in the minds of women and men that defenses of peace must be constructed. As we're working towards finalizing our next strategic plan that will run from 2023 to 2028, we have identified 3 key actions that will strengthen the resilience of our education system when we're going through acute crisis. And I'll end with listing those 3 priorities briefly. First, the relevance of technology. We have approved an ICT for education strategy, and this is key in our efforts to strengthen our education program so it can adapt to humanitarian crisis. Technology also supports development through providing greater digital literacy, and this is paramount in a fast-evolving digital world. On this, Palestine refugee children and youth must not be left behind. And I would like to share with you a very good example on what this can yield if we have the investments. In our new IT hub in Gaza, for example, where there are very, very few livelihood opportunities for Palestine youth, we are now operating an IT center that serves the UN system, and we've increased the number of employees from 3 to 120 in only 2 years, because they're digitally literate, because they can provide those services even though they are not allowed to travel out of the territory. And second, we're further strengthening our human rights, conflict resolution and tolerance in education program. In a region full of tension, tolerance is a scarce commodity. By improving our students' understanding of human rights concepts, by providing them with conflict resolution skills, and by encouraging tolerance, we build their resilience. And through that, we foster a culture of peace. And third, and this is my last example, and the third of our key priorities going forward, we're significantly strengthening our psychosocial support system. According to recent data, over a quarter of our students in Gaza enter grade 1 with symptoms of severe trauma. Lack of mental health is a break to quality education, and with that, an obstacle to development. We include psychosocial support in our education and emergency program, and are currently working to ensure a threefold increase in the number of school counselors throughout our 5 fields. And we are aware that more than 60% of the students in UNRWA schools start the day without a breakfast. And on an empty stomach, you cannot learn. We are making efforts to address this, but we cannot do it alone. So, to conclude, significant investments are needed, and meanwhile, UNRWA is running our education program on a shoestring. Our education program must be fully funded, but it must also be provided with predictable multi-year funding, as we've heard from many of the other speakers in this panel. And we need additional investments to ensure Palestine refugees do not miss the train of digitalization. Donors must provide flexible funding to our education program. Today, the lack of flexibility between the development and the emergency funding portals of the agency prevents us from fully integrated or normal education program and our education and emergency program. So greater flexibility will allow us to respond more effectively in times of crisis, and it will ensure that Palestine refugee children will be able to access quality education during times of crisis. Thank you.
Deputy Commissioner General, thank you very much for both setting out the challenges and lots of the promising and good work that UNRWA is doing to support the education of Palestinian refugees under your care. Colleagues, we have passed the hour mark, so we've been going for an hour, and we've had a terrific interventions and learnt a lot. But for the next half hour, I really am going to hope that we have a bit of a conversation. And so after Heike Kuhn speaks from the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and the Development of Germany, I am going to be posing some questions to colleagues in the room who I know are keen to share some of their insights. And when we do, I want those comments to really be in response to the questions and very brief, because if we're good, we could get up to 15 people speaking between now and when we finish this session, if we speak for no more than 2 minutes each. So UNHCR talked about responsibility sharing for the global refugee crisis. I'm going to invite us all to be responsible for giving everyone in the room a go if they want to speak. So responsibility sharing in that context. So I'm going to implore you to be brief. So Heike, to begin.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I will be brief to allow the time for our discussion. So I have just 5 comments, and also I will reflect a little bit on the previous speakers. The need for education is very clear. Education is a human right. It is a human right of every little girl, of every little boy. We have just heard from Yasmin or from the previous speaker. And we are all committed to SDG 4. And we committed this, the 2030 agenda, this was in 2015, before the pandemic. And you think and you know what happens in between. So for donor Germany, we closely work with GPE and ECW, and we are proud to do so. We see especially the need for education in emergencies. And we've heard the figures, the frightening figures, 202 million children, Yasmin just said it. And therefore, Germany recently did a 200 million euro contribution to ECW. And I want to say this also, it's not only the money, but it is multi-year funding. And this is so important for the institutions, for ECW, because we know emergencies will be there. And we have heard what it is for and what they needed for school feeding, a lot of psycho issues. So they really need the money. So, and I do here encourage others to invest in education, donors, private foundations. And predictable financing is key for these institutions. My second point out of 5, we now follow a feminist development policy in Germany. With a female minister, there has been this shift, and we know women, girls and women are agents of change. My third remark, we cannot do this alone. We need the partner countries, and others have said it before, we need their interest to invest in education. And we are so proud last year with GPE's replenishment. We have the Kenyatta Declaration. We have the commitment of countries to invest, and we need the domestic financing. And my fourth point is, whom should we involve? And you see on these days over here at the summit, there's a lot of teachers. We are also working on teachers. We cannot learn and you cannot educate somebody without a teacher. And we need the young voices, young people. Let us ask them, let us hear their voices, and this has started already today. And my last point, I'm really happy or glad that the coordination between the institution, this is what we are looking as a donor at, that there is coordination, because we have these huge needs, and we have all the needs for money now to the Ukrainian war, to the high numbers of refugees. So I strongly ask, and I know this happens, I strongly ask GPE, ECW and others to coordinate. Thank you for your attention.
Heike, thank you for being brief, very to the point, and setting up the issue so compellingly. But above all, thank you for Germany's leadership in the education financing space and the recent contribution you made of 200 million. But colleagues, it doesn't stop there. Germany, along with the governments of Switzerland and Norway, are the donor member states that are supporting ECW's replenishment next year and hosting the replenishment high-level spending, high-level financing event so that you can spend the money afterwards in Switzerland in February. I should also acknowledge, though, that we have the Minister from South Sudan here, and I know that South Sudan is a partner country of ECW and is also one of the early partner country co-sponsors of that event. So thank you and congratulations to all of those member states who are leading the way in laying the foundations for a successful ECW replenishment in February. Colleagues, we have the Minister for Education from Yemen here, and I know that Yemen faces many challenges, and we are going to hear from him about that. I should say that we do not have, you might have noticed, simultaneous translation for this event, so I believe the Minister will speak, and then his colleague will provide translation in English. Thank you.
شكراً. حريص جدا أن ألتقي بكم. اليمن هي أحد بلدان العالم التي تعاني من الحروب وتعاني من حرب شرسة ومدمرة أثرت على البنية التحتية والتعليم بشكل عام. أكبر تحدي واجهنا نحن في الحكومة اليمنية ما الذي ممكن أن نعمله لانتظام العملية التعليمية والدراسة وانتظام التلاميذ في صفوف الدراسة. عملنا بكل جهد على أن تنتظم، وبذلت الحكومة في ظل ضعف الإمكانيات أن تسير كل المدارس في مواجهة كل المخاطر، سواء مخاطر الحرب أو مخاطر كورونا، عبر آليات محلية. الآليات المحلية هي أن استطعنا عبر مبادرات شعبية وسلطات محلية أن نوفر أجور للمعلمين ليستطيعوا القيام بمهامهم التعليمية للطلاب، وأيضا عبر دعم الشركاء والإقليميين والدوليين في هذا الجانب. أكبر تحدي واجهنا هي انتظام العملية التعليمية والتربوية في زمن الحرب وفي زمن الدمار والخراب، وأيضا التحديات الماثلة أمامنا هو الدمار والخراب الذي حصل في البنية التحتية والذي نتج عن انقلاب على السلطات الدولة الشرعية.
The minister just said thank you very much for allowing him to talk, and he mentioned the biggest challenge in Yemen is about war and conflict in the country. He was saying that his government did a lot of efforts to try to find solutions to these challenges, which results of war, and in addition to this coronavirus. He mentioned the public initiatives to participate towards paying salaries for teachers, getting children back to schools. He also mentioned the strong partnership with the international partners of the government. He also mentioned that also among the biggest challenges in Yemen is how to make the educational system continue within the both coronavirus and war. He also mentioned that there is a huge collapse for the and destruction of many of schools and educational institutions, and the country is in a very need assistance to go over these destructions and difficult situations. He mentioned that we had many countries who are facing difficulties, but Yemen is like a forgotten crisis. Thank you.
Shukran. Thank you very much, Minister, for sharing those remarks. And as you say, definitely a forgotten crisis in many of the world's eyes, but incredible needs across the piece that you referred to. I just want to stay with some of the countries that are facing crisis and doing a valiant job in trying to protect the rights of education, true education of their children. And I want to turn to the Minister for Education from Lebanon. Welcome back to UNESCO, Minister. I'm very conscious that you were last here at the Global Education meeting hosted by UNESCO, where we heard from you when you'd just been appointed. I'm fascinated to hear how it's going and what you've been doing in Lebanon to support education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and for giving me this chance to meet this prestigious meeting. Lebanon, it's an example. I would prefer to speak in French, but I will arrange myself in English. Lebanon is an example of cumulative crisis and an example how to face crisis. That's why I will speak on 3 points. Descriptive, the situation in Lebanon is a cumulative crisis. It means it is also instability in politics instability, economic crisis, financial crisis, social crisis, and with the COVID and the explosion of the port of Beirut. All this make really a big problem how to recuperate the education system and to make it running in a good way. Second, I called for stakeholders to make a table of dialogue, and I ask everyone to stay on the same table and to study how to make a issue for the for keeping the schools running and working normally. And we want this year to make at least a normal, between brackets, a school year. And now we are doing and organizing the official exams. And to recuperate the learning loss, we are planning to do the summer school. And we are starting also to think about the next year school year. Because of the donors, we make two programs. One a program and the other is fund. With the Unicef and EU and German and other donors, which I will address for them all our thankful for their initiative, we did a fund, Transition and Resilience Education Fund. It allows us to face our crisis and especially to implement governance and to do a partnership within all the stakeholders of the education. And with UNESCO, and thanks also to UNESCO and to Education Cannot Wait and other donors, we make what we call it the MERP, Multi-Year Resilience Program. In this issue, we are working on 4 outcomes. First one, crisis-affected girls and boys have access to inclusive, gender-responsive, and relevant quality learning. Second, crisis-affected girls and boys learn in inclusive, gender-responsive, and protective learning environments where their specific needs are met. Third, crisis-affected girls and boys and adolescents achieve better learning outcomes in education. And the last one, fourth, sufficient resources are mobilized to scale implementation of the program and to monitor program quality based on robust evidence base. I finish. About transformative emergency education response, we don't have another choice to continue our school and to continue our system of education to work properly for next year. Because Lebanon has this privilege to have his education. If we lost it, we don't have anymore any other privilege in Lebanon. And you know, the Lebanese are everywhere in the world because of their education is high quality. And that's why we have a refugee problem. Also, we should face this. We shouldn't leave anyone without a school, because if we leave any kind of student without a school, we will be facing for more security problem. That's why, for us, it is very important to keep going by our system, educational system, and we are going to prepare our next school year and to thank the donors. They stand and they stood next to Lebanon to face all this problem, but there is another thing I should mention it before I finish, that because of this crisis, the salary doesn't worth any value for the teacher. If there is no incentive for the teacher to go to the school and to pay their transport, we cannot assure a good school year for this coming year. And that's why I'm calling everyone to rethink about their program in Lebanon and to stand next to our system, educational system, because that is the only way to continue working properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Excellent. And you've been busy since we last saw you here at UNESCO doing all of those things. And thank you too for ending on reminding us of the fiscal challenge which the world faces collectively, which is also exacerbating so many of our challenges. So with that in mind, I actually want to turn quickly to the financing issue just for a few moments and unpack that, because we heard about the Global Hub for Education and Emergencies, our latest report. And Petra, I just wondered if you could give us a top-line kind of killer stat about what the finding of that report is. And then after that, I'm going to turn to both the private sector in the form of the Lego Foundation and the World Bank to say a little bit about how they're addressing some of those financing challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and colleagues, for the opportunity to very briefly outline a few of the findings. And I think many of you have said it. The needs have just massively increased. That means that while we have seen increased financing over the years, EIE, Education Emergencies, just remains chronically underfunded. So fundamentally, we do need stronger political commitment so that we can address the education of all these children and youth who are left out. We heard it very clearly this morning. The youth prioritize education. It's high up on their agenda, and they want to go and get their future, but attacks, climate change, violence are impeding it. So we also have seen in the study that funding is skewed towards high-profile crises that either have received extensive media coverage or are geopolitically important to donors. More needs to be done to address the inequities and unpredictability of education funding so that all children and youth have access to education. And maybe a final point, if you may allow, we do need a more joined-up approach between humanitarian funding and development cooperation. ODA for education in crisis countries reached nearly 6 billion in 2020, more than 8 times than humanitarian assistance. This can be leveraged to support better learning outcomes for children and youth, and that will only happen with greater coordination among all the partners. Thank you so much.
Terrific. Thank you, Petra. And can you just say, if colleagues are interested in the detail in the report, where it's available?
Yes, you can find it at www.eiehub.org.
eiehub.org. Fantastic. Correct. Great. So I'm just interested in turning to our colleague, the Vice President of Human Development at the World Bank. The World Bank, as I said, was one of the agencies that supported the pledge at the Global Refugee Summit. But of course, it's got a growing portfolio of support for fragile and conflict-affected states via its IDA instruments, including education. And I was just wondering if you could give us a bit of a picture of how you're responding to some of these challenges.
Thank you. I should make clear I'm not the Vice President. I'm the Chief Economist for Human Development, representing the Vice President, Mamta Murthy. The World Bank has a portfolio of about 24 billion in active education programs, and about 1/4 of that, and growing, is in FCV settings, and we expect this to continue on growing. I think the challenge that we all face and that we have to face up to is sort of, in some sense, merging or thinking through where the overlap is between the session right before this, which is the session on how do we ensure that all children have at least the basic foundational skills to be able to be successful in society, and at the same time, how do we do that in settings that are particularly difficult, like FCV settings? And what are the commonalities? What are the things that we can, in some sense, bring in from one and to the other, and what are the key differences? And I think that's really sort of at the heart of the difficulties that we face if you want delivering services here. I think it's pretty clear that the world is facing an unprecedented education crisis, and that nowhere is this more dire, and nowhere are children and young people more affected than in FCV settings. We, the World Bank, have a new approach paper which tries to outline what we think are the priorities for education in FCV settings. I won't go through my talking points because for the interest of time, but the approach paper, it's called Safe and Learning in the Midst of Fragility, Conflict and Violence. And in some sense, what it does is it lays out, as I said a second ago, what are those things that translate from one setting to another and which ones are particular to FCV settings and what can we learn there. It makes many important points, and I won't go through all the details, but I want to emphasize perhaps one point out of that, which is that we strongly believe that it is critical that education programs in FCV settings serve all affected groups in the conflict. And by that I mean IDPs, refugees, but also critically host communities. And we think that this is the only way in which these programs can be politically sustainable, but also very often these host communities face many of the same problems that drove people into forced displacement to begin with, and so integrating this in a vision that encompasses both those directly affected but also the host communities we think is critical. I'm happy to talk more on other matters, but as I said, in the interest of time, I've sort of largely ignored my talking points and provided some off-the-cuff remarks. Thank you.
Well, they were quality remarks, so that's often the case, right? So we appreciate you departing from your script and being brief, but I think it's added a lot to the conversation. A colleague from the LEGO Foundation is here, and I just wanted to ask LEGO Foundation how we can secure more support from private philanthropic foundations for this task.
Thank you, Chair. And as well, I think a lot has already been covered. I think one area is obviously in funding, and certainly at the LEGO Foundation, along with other foundations, we fund and support many of the organizations here in this space. I think another key area that I want to highlight is actually the role of convening and advocacy around this piece where others can't necessarily do that. And a good example I would give would be the work that we and others do through the Moving Minds Alliance, not least to make sure that while we all talk of education and education in emergencies, that we don't forget early childhood within that, the area that within an underfunded area is chronically underfunded. And that's something we with others have spent a lot of our time, money and efforts on focusing on. And beyond that, I think where the private sector more largely can focus is in areas like parenting, in building up the knowledge base for the skills that are needed in early childhood generally, and education in emergencies, and also for using the brands that many of us have that can reach the audiences we need to understand this, both in host countries and in crisis-affected countries. There's a lot more we all could do, but the movement building, the convening, and the advocacy that we think we can do with everybody in this room is something we would be open to do more of. Thank you, Chair.
Terrific. Thank you, Ewan, and I think there'll be lots of people in this room who will be taking you up on that offer and want to work with LEGO to do exactly that. A member state that has been doing exactly that, convening stakeholders in respect of this question, is Canada. They've been very interested in the refugee issue, very committed to that for a number of years, co-sponsored the education track of the preparations for the Global Compact on Refugees, and they remain committed to that issue. So I'm delighted now to turn to the Parliamentary Secretary for International Development from Canada to share her remarks about what Canada is doing in respect to some of these issues.
Yes, thank you very much, and it is a real pleasure to exchange ideas today, particularly on how we transform education, particularly in contexts of crisis. And I think the first thing is to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, and that we really need to listen to those with lived experience, particularly the most marginalized, which are refugee and displaced children, gender equality, girls, and those with disabilities. And one of the things we've been doing is being very deliberate in the way in which we design our programming. And one of the things that we've done is we have, just this past March, we had a Together for Learning Summit where we included the voices, Canada's Refugee Council included the voices of youth. And these young refugees launched a youth manifesto. And it's very interesting because so many of the points that came out in that manifesto are the same things that we've heard echoed throughout the day today. And those include inclusion, mental health and psychosocial supports, digital learning, gender equality, and improved accountability. And I think it's very important that we listen to that, but more importantly is the fact that as leaders, and in our case as elected officials, we have more than a voice, we have a megaphone. And the best thing about having a megaphone is that you can give it to someone else. And we strongly encourage everybody that between now and September, we give that megaphone to the youth, to those who are impacted, and make sure that when we are designing our programming, we really are listening to their voices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. So I think by the clock in front of me, colleagues, we have about 3 minutes left. So I think that's probably time for about 3 more interventions. I wanted to call, if they're a minute each, I wanted to call our colleagues from Education Above All. Mary Joy, could you say something in response to the conversation we've had today from your perspective?
Thank you very much, and greetings from Qatar. I think what we've been talking about today is the challenge of complexity. And in that, it's really important for us to work together. We all have different comparative advantages, and it's important that we begin to work together to make these function better. Because one of the things we always talk about is we talk about the policies, but in fact, policies are empty if they don't actually result in practice. And if the policy and practice really need to be inseparable. So I think one area that we haven't talked about a lot today, but I would like to point to, is where we can do this is in the area of the protection of education. We've heard so much about how devastated our systems are due to conflict, due to different crises, floods, all those kinds of things. One very practical thing that we can do is to really get accurate, timely, reliable data on attacks on education. Because with this, we can then, one, respond appropriately because we know where it is, what it is, how it happened, what needs to be done, who was affected the most. And we can then also hold the perpetrators, the actors, and yes, non-actors, because there are actually those who just stand by and watch this happen. We can hold them all accountable. So what I would really argue is this is another area where we, with some of our other partners, including the GCPA, are working together. We really want to contribute to this so that when we do have the loud voice, it's pointed, it's accurate, it points to a specific incident, and it allows action on the ground to make things better for those kids and their teachers and their families. Thank you.
Mary Joy, thank you very much for that. I'm delighted that we were able to call you and for you to bring us back to that really important issue, which we began the discussion with, which was an acknowledgement of one of the other threats to education in a lot of these contexts, which is direct attacks on staff, on personnel, and on students. So thank you for your work on that and for encouraging us to think about what more we can do on that. I want to turn now briefly to the Minister from South Sudan. To speak very briefly and maybe just to share her reflections on today's meeting as one of the partner member states of this effort.
Thank you very much. I would just have 4 points. What should be done in emergency situation? The current environment has put education in difficulties. Therefore, we must work collectively and together and come up with solutions that will address the needs of education globally and nationally. One, there must be a balance between humanitarian assistance intervention and education in crisis situation. Both should be addressed hand in hand. Two, We must empower the teachers and PTA in those displaced communities and refugees to continue to provide education to the children. And 3, prioritize support to girl education and children with disabilities as the most marginalized group in education. And 4, we need to construct semi-permanent structures in the school for displaced communities, whether displaced by war or displaced by national disaster. And I cannot agree more than saying financing education, investing in education will send more children to school across the world. And I wanted to use the example of South Sudan. What can education do in conflict situation? The armed youth drop the guns and they pick up the books. This has happened recently, and we were not having hope that to happen. So I want to conclude by saying I commend the multi-donors and partners for continuous support to education in South Sudan and across the world. I take this opportunity to appeal to all our donors, the key donors, partners, and colleagues in private sector, my colleagues in the government who are in this room, especially GP, ECW, UK, AID, European Union, and the rest to continue to support education of children of South Sudan and beyond South Sudan. Investing in this education, we are investing for the future. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for both those powerful remarks and a very practical 4-point plan. And I know I've got some colleagues in the room. I want to make sure that we capture what those 4 points are and amplify them for you because it was very clear. Minister, you referenced a number of your partners there, including the UK. And I just want to now just turn to Judith Herbertson from the FCDO, one of your supporters, one of your donors, but obviously a donor in this space more generally, and just ask Judith for 1 or 2 points about what the UK is going to do between now and September to support the transformation of this work.
Thank you. I'm going to focus on the principles that are going to underpin what we're going to do, because we know that education too often in humanitarian contexts is the poor relation. Firstly, keep a focus on the children, find out what they need, and don't let political considerations mess things up even further for the most traumatised and the most vulnerable. Secondly, don't let the politicians play out their political agendas using refugees and children as the soft target, as a way of influencing the way the international community will respond. We see it happen too often. Thirdly, I want us to focus on the long-term solution for refugees, those displaced, those living in crisis, whatever that context is, but also to tackle the short-term blockages and not let one become the enemy of the other. We have to be satisfied with Plan B, although we should keep our sights on Plan A for those that are most vulnerable and need our help. Fourthly, budgets are finite. We know that. We cannot find more money down the back of the sofa or anywhere else. It's awful when we hear about forgotten crises. We always want to give more, but money is limited. So learning what works, doing the most necessary, and doing it in a really good value for money way is an imperative. Very quickly, trust the experts to do the coordination. There are lots of people in this field. Nobody can afford to compete, duplicate, overlap, leave massive gaps, and that includes individual donors not being allowed to pursue their individual ideas as to what works best at the expense of overall operations. There is always somebody that can lead and coordinate, and we should trust them to do so. Focus on foundational learning, because that will take you anywhere. If children don't lose their childhood, but they learn to read and do maths and learn how to learn and be together, that will take them forward when they get out of the awful crisis. And the very last thing is, Working in a crisis is no excuse for lowering our standards. We cannot allow safeguarding issues, protection issues, or they'll just have to deal with it because they're already vulnerable to be any one of our watchwords. Thank you.
So, colleagues, I've just been negotiating because I know a number of you, I'm going to disappoint a number of you in the room who haven't had a chance to speak and wanted to, but we're quite keen to hear from two last member states. So I'm actually going to call on the Minister of Education from Haiti in the first instance to get their perspective very briefly about the challenges there. And then we're going to leave the final remarks to the government of Switzerland, and I'll say why after our colleague from Haiti has spoken. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief. Just 3 points. First of all, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to participate in this conversation. Haiti is the perfect example to demonstrate what works or does not work about emergency education response. In 2010, an earthquake killed nearly 200,000 people, among them many teachers, destroyed hospitals and schools. More than $4 billion have been collected. 12 years later, there was another earthquake, and there was a lot of damage. Same situation in 2010. The national and international bureaucracy are a huge obstacle. Money is not the only answer. Timing is everything. My second point is that there's a big difference on the ground between money and resources. Victims are not just victims. Local populations are not just victims. There are human resources with enormous potential. They have ideas and good ideas. Recently, we have been able to reopen schools that have been closed for 2 years because of violence. It was possible because it was the Parent Teachers Association who have led the process. My last point is about synchronization. Coordination is essential, but not enough. Because of this economic, social, health crisis, what we need now is beyond coordination, in what I call synchronization. A perfect example in when we get to use local agriculture in school feeding program in order to give more revenues to the local population. When young people have income, they are less vulnerable and less likely to be recruited by gangs, and peace is more likely to be reality. Certainly, together we have made a lot of progress, but those transformations are important if we want to achieve the SDG 4. This is why this morning, the GPE ministers issued a communiqué proposing concrete action aimed at transforming our education system. Before concluding, let me thank the Unicef, UNESCO, UNHCR, ECW, GPE, and others in the room for their commitment in Haiti. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister, including for those sharp remarks and for really pointing to the opportunity of synchronization. I love that phrase that you gave us. That'll be a big takeaway for me, where we bring different sectors together, including, as you said, local agricultural sector to support school feeding and food security. So some great suggestions there. So, colleagues, we're laying the foundations for the path to September, to the Transforming Education Summit. But, of course, that summit won't be the end. There are a variety of actions that need to be taken immediately after that, and this is a long-term venture. But the next moment after that, at least one of which we know about, is, of course, the Education Cannot Wait replenishment, which, as I said, will be hosted by Switzerland in February. So I want to call on our Swiss colleagues to talk us through what that pathway is to February, and how we can all support them in the effort which they're leading on the education financing front. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for all the previous speakers. Really, I mean, I feel it's been a very enriching, really, dialogue today. I think, yes. So we have Switzerland. We have heard the call for that. There's an urgent need to address seriously the issue of education in emergencies, I believe. So for this reason, maybe I will shorten my speaking points to very short. So I will concentrate on 3 points. So for this reason, I believe Switzerland, together with many partners which are present here today, launched last year the Global Hub for Education in Emergencies in Geneva. And the hub, as we've heard before, provides also a platform for synergies between a multitude of actors for joint transformative actions. It's been also said it is crucial, we believe, not to duplicate efforts, but to support synergies between governments, organizations, and agencies. So secondly, we also believe that an urgent collective effort to transform the provision and financing of quality education is needed, and therefore, beyond our own financing, we are doubling our efforts to mobilize other partners to provide additional financial resources or expertise. And therefore, we will co-host, as you said, the high-level conference on financing education cannot wait next year in Geneva in February. Thirdly, it's been mentioned before, I believe, by Yasmina Sharif and also Robert Jenkins, that investing in education in emergencies goes hand in hand with the question of long-term funding of education. And we must remind the world, also by way of the upcoming Transforming Education Summit, that when we invest in education, we're also investing in peaceful and stable societies and laying the foundation for sustainable economic growth. And just at the end, I would like to again quote the UNESCO Constitution: since war starts in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men and women that we must start building the foundations for peace. And we really believe, especially in this sector, this is a very, very, very good quote. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that and for your leadership, your support for the Hub, and of course your co-sponsorship with other member states who are here today of the high-level financing event next year. And indeed, you won't get any arguments from anyone in this room about the fact that education indeed is the foundation for peace. And so I think with that note, we will end. I do want to thank you, all of the speakers, for their interventions. There were some powerful remarks, lots of very compelling accounts of the need, but also some promising developments which we all need to get behind. I want to thank all of you who are here who didn't speak for your participation, but above all, I want to thank every one of you, not for being here, but for what you will do as a result of the conversation we've had today to close the education and emergencies gap and to deliver the right to education to those children who currently don't have it because they're affected by humanitarian crises. Good luck in that effort. I look forward to hearing back from you all at the next time we meet about what you've done and the progress that we together have all collectively made. Thank you. Thank you.